In the summer of 1982, a sponge diver named Mehmed Shakir descended through the blue waters off Uluburun, a rocky promontory on Turkey's southwestern coast. He was looking for sponges. What he found instead was the cargo hold of a world. Scattered across the seabed at a depth of 44 metres lay the remains of a ship that had gone down more than 3,000 years before. A vessel carrying 10 tons of copper ingots, a ton of pure tin, Canaanite jars filled with aromatic resin, Baltic amber from the frozen north, an Italian sword, cylinder seals from Mesopotamia, hippopotamus ivory, African ebony, ostrich eggshells, and the personal effects of Mycenaean Greeks. The ship had been heading west, probably toward the Aegean, when it sank. Its cargo represented the entire known world of the Late Bronze Age, compressed into a single wooden hull. Copper from Cyprus, tin from mines so distant that the journey to reach them would have taken months, resin from the Levantine coast, prized for incense and perfume, gold from Egypt, glass ingots in cobalt blue, pomegranates, almonds, figs, olives, and grain. Perishable goods that spoke of a trade network so reliable that merchants could ship fresh produce across hundreds of miles of open sea. The Uluburun ship was not exceptional. It was ordinary. That is what makes it so astonishing. Sometime around 1300 BCE, when this vessel slipped beneath the waves, the eastern Mediterranean was bound together by a web of exchange so dense, so sophisticated, and so thoroughly taken for granted that a single merchant ship could carry the products of a dozen different civilizations. The great powers of the age, Egypt, Hatti, Babylon, Assyria, Mycenaean Greece, the island kingdom of Alatia on Cyprus, the merchant cities of the Syrian coast, were not isolated realms glaring at each other across hostile frontiers. They were partners, they traded, they corresponded, they married their children to one another and exchanged gifts of gold and lapis lazuli and elaborately worked bronze vessels. They shared technologies and artistic styles, and even in certain circles a common diplomatic language. The scribes of Hattusa wrote to the scribes of Pyrames. The king of Babylon sent his daughter to the palace of Pharaoh. Mycenaean pottery turned up in the tombs of Egyptian nobles, and Egyptian scarabs appeared in the graves of Greek warriors. This was not the world we imagine when we think of the ancient past. Not a collection of primitive kingdoms groping in the darkness, separated by impassable distances and mutual incomprehension. This was a system, a network, a civilization of civilizations, as intricate and interdependent as any that has existed since. And like any complex system, it had a fatal flaw. It could fail all at once. Let us begin where the Bronze Age began, with bronze itself. Bronze is an alloy, a marriage of two metals that are rarely found together in nature. Copper is the foundation, soft, malleable, easily worked and present in useful quantities in a handful of locations around the ancient world. But copper alone makes poor weapons and tools. It bends, it dulls, it cannot hold an edge. To transform copper into bronze, you must add tin, and tin is one of the rarest metals on Earth. The great copper deposits of Cyprus, which the ancients knew as Alashaya, produced ore of legendary purity. Lead isotope analysis of the Uluburun ingots confirms what the ancient letters suggest. Cyprus was the beating heart of the Bronze Age copper trade, shipping thousands of tons of the red metal across the Mediterranean over the course of centuries. In the Amarna archive, letters from the king of Alashir to the pharaoh of Egypt record shipments of 26 tons of copper in a single 30-year period. This was industrial-scale extraction, organised production, international commerce. But the tin had to come from elsewhere, and elsewhere in this case meant the far side of the known world. The richest tin deposits accessible to the Bronze Age lay in Afghanistan and in the mountains of what is now Uzbekistan, a journey of thousands of miles from the Mediterranean, across deserts and mountain ranges, through kingdoms and tribal territories that rose and fell with the generations. Some tin also came from the Taurus Mountains of Anatolia, closer to hand but still requiring long overland journeys and complex chains of intermediaries. The tin ingots recovered from the Uluburun wreck tell this story in chemical signatures, ore from Afghan mines, smelted somewhere along the way, cast into standardized ingots, and loaded aboard a Canaanite ship in a Levantine port for transport to the Aegean. The journey from mine to Mediterranean must have taken years and involved dozens of transactions. The mathematics of bronze are unforgiving. The ideal ratio is roughly 9 parts copper to 1 part tin, sometimes 10 to 1 depending on the intended use. Without tin, there is no bronze. Without bronze, there are no swords, no spearheads, no chariot fittings, no elite display goods, no palace economies, no king's treasury. The entire apparatus of late Bronze Age civilization, its wars, its diplomacy, its monumental architecture, its systems of administration and control, rested on the continued flow of a rare metal from the mountains of Central Asia to the forges of the Mediterranean world. The Uluburun ship carried enough tin to produce 11 metric tons of bronze. The excavators who brought it up calculated that this single cargo could have equipped nearly 5,000 soldiers with bronze swords. One ship, one cargo, one link in a chain of supply that stretched from the Hindu Kush to the palace workshops of Mycenaean. Now imagine that chain breaking. To understand what was lost, we must first understand what existed. And what existed in the 13th century BCE was something unprecedented in human history, an international order. The evidence for this order survives in clay. Cuneiform tablets, wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft clay and baked hard by kiln or sun, were the recording medium of the ancient Near East, and the palace archives that have come down to us contain thousands of them. The most famous are the Amarna letters, discovered in 1887 in the ruins of Akhetaten, the short-lived capital of the pharaoh Akhenaten. But similar archives have been found at Hattusa, the Hittite capital, at Ugarit on the Syrian coast, at Babylonian sites throughout Mesopotamia. Taken together, they reveal a diplomatic world of startling sophistication. The great kings addressed one another as brother. They exchanged gifts on a scale that would put modern state visits to shame. Gold by the talent, lapis lazuli by the shipload, elaborately worked chariots and teams of horses, bolts of dyed wool and linen, ivory furniture inlaid with precious stones. They sent their daughters to marry one another's sons and their physicians to treat one another's illnesses. They negotiated treaties and alliances, complained about the quality of gifts received, demanded the extradition of fugitives, and haggled over the terms of trade. The language of this diplomacy was Akkadian, the East Semitic tongue of Babylon and Assyria, which served as the lingua franca of the entire Near East. A Hittite king writing to an Egyptian pharaoh would compose his letter in Akkadian. An official at Ugarit corresponding with an Assyrian merchant would use the same language. Even the rulers of Mycenaean Greece, whose native tongue was an early form of Greek, participated in this international system, trading with Egypt and the Levant, sending embassies to the courts of the great kings. This was not mere exchange of pleasantries. The correspondence reveals a working system of international relations with understood rules and expectations. Great kings, the rulers of Egypt, Hatti, Babylon, Assyria and Mitanni, dealt with one another as equals. Lesser kings and vassal rulers occupied subordinate positions, owing tribute and military service to their overlords, but protected in turn by the great king's power. The entire structure was held together by marriage alliances, gift exchange, and the constant flow of diplomatic correspondence. When the king of Babylon complained that the pharaoh's gifts were insufficient, or when the king of Hatti demanded the return of a runaway subject, they were invoking shared norms and expectations that all parties understood. At the apex of this system, around 1200 BCE, stood 4 great powers. Egypt under Ramses III was the oldest and in its own estimation the greatest of them all. The new kingdom had endured for nearly 4 centuries, from the expulsion of the Hyksos invaders around 1550 BCE to the last of the Ramessides in the 11th century. Its monuments were already ancient. The pyramids of Giza had stood for more than 1,000 years. The temples of Karnak had grown through dynasty after dynasty of additions and embellishments, and the memory of imperial expansion under Thutmose III still echoed in the royal titulary. The reign of Ramses Thekt, Ramses the Great, builder of Abu Simbel and Per-Rameses, victor of Kadesh, signatory of history's first known peace treaty with the Hittites, had ended only decades before, in 1213 BCE. His successor, Merneptah, had beaten back an invasion from Libya and a possible incursion of sea peoples in the 5th year of his reign. Now Ramses III, third king of the 20th dynasty, sat on the throne of the two lands, inheritor of a civilization that measured its age in millennia. Egypt controlled the Nile, and the Nile was the most productive agricultural system in the ancient world. The annual flood deposited rich silt across the valley floor, producing grain surpluses that no other region could match. Egyptian wheat and barley fed not only the teeming population of the Nile Valley, but also, in times of crisis, the hungry mouths of distant kingdoms. The letters preserved in the archives at Hattusa and Ugarit reveal this clearly. When famine struck Anatolia or the Levant, it was to Egypt that the great kings turned for grain. The land of the pharaohs was the breadbasket of the Bronze Age world. But Egypt had never been self-sufficient in everything. It imported copper from Cyprus and Sinai, tin from the Transasiatic routes, timber from the forests of Lebanon, and luxury goods from every corner of the known world. The tomb paintings of Thebes show foreign tribute bearers arriving with their distinctive goods: Nubians with gold and exotic animals, Syrians with fine textiles and metalwork, Aegean peoples with vessels in the distinctive Mycenaean style. Egypt was not an island. It was the anchor of a system, and the system required its continued stability. To the north, beyond the Sinai and the coastal cities of Canaan, lay the second great power, Hatti. The Hittite Empire had emerged from the Anatolian highlands in the 2nd millennium BCE, gradually expanding to control most of Asia Minor and, at its greatest extent under Suppiluliuma III, reaching deep into Syria to challenge Egyptian hegemony. The Hittite capital of Hattusa sprawled across a mountainous site in north-central Anatolia, defended by massive walls of Cyclopean masonry and studded with temples to the 1,000 gods of the Hittite pantheon. The royal archives contained treaties with vassal states, diplomatic correspondence with Egypt and Babylon, ritual texts, legal codes, and administrative records. A window into the workings of an empire that, at its height, rivaled Egypt in power and sophistication. The Hittites had done what no other power had managed. They had fought Egypt to a standstill. The Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, where Ramses II had confronted the forces of Muwatalli II, ended in something close to a draw, despite Ramses's later boasts of total victory. The peace treaty that followed, concluded between Ramses II and Hattusili III, bound the two empires together in alliance. Hittite princesses married into the Egyptian royal house. Diplomatic correspondence flowed between Pyrameses and Hattusa. The two great powers of the Near East had found a modus vivendi, and for 2 generations they maintained it. But by the time Suppiluliuma II came to the throne around 1207 BCE, the empire was already under strain. The Hittite realm was a patchwork of vassal kingdoms, each bound to the great king by treaty and subject to periodic rebellion. The Casca peoples of the northern mountains had never been fully subdued. They raided Hittite territory whenever the central power wavered. Internal disputes over the succession had weakened the royal house, and the harvests were failing. Across the Aegean, on the rocky peninsulas and islands of Greece, a different kind of civilization had taken shape. The Mycenaeans were Greeks, the earliest Greeks whose language we can read, thanks to the decipherment of the Linear B script in 1952. Their palace centres at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos and elsewhere were not copies of Near Eastern models, but something new. Fortified citadels crowning rocky acropolis sites, surrounded by settlements of merchants and craftsmen, administering territories that stretched across the fertile plains of the Argolid and Messenia. The walls of Mycenae were built of stones so massive that later Greeks attributed them to the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants of myth, since no ordinary human could have lifted such blocks into place. Behind those walls, the palace bureaucracy kept meticulous records in Linear B, tallying flocks of sheep, allocating bronze to smiths, tracking the rations of olive oil distributed to workers, noting the textile production of women in the palace workshops. The Mycenaean palace economy was a system of centralized redistribution. The palace collected agricultural surplus, stored it in great magazines, and dispensed it in the form of rations to dependent workers, craftsmen, soldiers, priests, slaves. Bronze production was a palace monopoly. Olive oil and grain flowed into the palace storerooms and out again in carefully measured allocations. The Linear B tablets that survive are not literary texts or royal propaganda, but inventory lists and work assignments. The paperwork of an administrative state concerned with the precise management of resources. How many bronzesmiths at Pylos? How much wool is owed by such and such a village? How many rowers are to be stationed at certain coastal points? This was not a primitive society. This was a complex, literate, bureaucratically organized civilization integrated into the wider Mediterranean world through trade and diplomacy. Mycenaean pottery has been found in Egypt, in the Levant, in Cyprus, in Anatolia. Egyptian and Near Eastern luxury goods appear in Mycenaean graves. The Mycenaeans were active participants in the international system, trading partners of Ugarit and Cyprus, known to the Hittites who called them Ahyawa, sending embassies and merchant ships across the sea. And yet the palace economies of Mycenaean Greece were extraordinarily brittle. Efficiency came at the cost of resilience. The redistribution system worked only as long as the surplus kept flowing in and the palace retained the administrative capacity to allocate it. If the harvest failed, if trade routes were disrupted, if the bronze stopped coming from Cyprus and the tin from the east, the entire system would begin to collapse. There was no margin for error, no redundancy, no fallback. The fourth pillar of the late Bronze Age system was not an empire but a city, Ugarit. On the Syrian coast, where the fertile plains of the Levant met the sea, Ugarit occupied a position of extraordinary strategic importance. It was a crossroads, a meeting point of worlds. To the east lay the caravan routes running through Mesopotamia toward the distant highlands of Iran and Afghanistan. To the west lay the sea, and the maritime routes linking the Levant to Cyprus, the Aegean, and Egypt. To the north, the roads ran up through the Syrian interior toward Hatti. To the south, they descended along the coast toward Canaan and the borders of Egyptian territory. Everything passed through Ugarit. Copper and tin, textiles and timber, grain and oil and wine, the royal correspondence of empires and the invoices of merchants. The city had been occupied for millennia, but it was in the late Bronze Age that Ugarit reached its greatest prosperity. The royal palace sprawled across the summit of the Tell, with its own archives, its own scribal schools and its own international correspondence. Several thousand cuneiform tablets have been recovered from the ruins, written in Akkadian, Hurrian, Hittite, and Ugarit's own alphabetic cuneiform script, one of the earliest alphabets known to history. The merchants of Ugarit traded with everyone, Egypt and Hatti, Cyprus and Crete, Mesopotamia and the Aegean. They were middlemen, facilitators, the lubricant that kept the gears of the international system turning smoothly. The king of Ugarit was a vassal of the Hittite great king, bound by treaty to provide tribute and military support. But the relationship was mutually beneficial. Hittite protection allowed Ugarit to flourish. Ugarit's trade revenue enriched the Hittite treasury. The letters in the archives reveal a city at the centre of a vast commercial web, handling shipments of grain and copper, arranging loans and partnerships, mediating disputes between merchants of a dozen different origins. The Canaanite jars found on the Ulubaran ship, at least 149 of them, filled with terebinth resin prized for incense and perfume, were products of this coastal trading world, loaded aboard in ports like Ugarit for transport to customers across the sea. By the late 13th century, Ugarit was flourishing. Its population numbered in the thousands. Its merchants were wealthy. Its king corresponded with the great powers as an equal among lesser kings. The city had stood for centuries and would, its inhabitants surely believed, stand for centuries more. In the archives of Ugarit, archaeologists found a letter. The clay tablet was baked hard, not in a kiln, as tablets were when they were meant to be preserved, but by fire. The fire that had destroyed the city around 1185 BCE had turned the unbaked tablet into a permanent record, freezing the moment of catastrophe in clay. "The cities are burning," the letter read. It had never been sent. This, then, was the world of bronze and letters, a system so interconnected that a ship sinking off the Turkish coast could carry the products of a dozen different civilizations, so sophisticated that kings addressed one another as brothers and negotiated treaties across thousands of miles, so prosperous that palace scribes spent their days tallying flocks of sheep and allocations of olive oil, secure in the assumption that the world they knew would continue forever. The copper of Cyprus, the tin of Afghanistan, the grain of Egypt, the timber of Lebanon, the textiles of Ugarit, the bronze weapons of the palace armories, the chariots of the great kings, the diplomatic letters travelling by messenger from court to court, all of it formed a single system, a web of exchange and dependence that had no precedent in human history and would have no parallel for more than 2,000 years. The Ulubaran ship, with its 10 tons of copper and its ton of tin, its Baltic amber and its Italian sword, its Mesopotamian cylinder seals and its Canaanite jars, was a snapshot of that system at its height. The cargo represented not just wealth, but connectivity. Materials and goods from every corner of the known world flowing together into a single hold, destined for customers who expected their orders to arrive on schedule. If the tin stopped coming, there would be no bronze. If there was no bronze, there would be no weapons, no tools, no palace economies. If the palace economies collapsed, there would be no scribes to keep records, no administrators to distribute rations, no kings to maintain the treaties that held the international order together. The system was efficient because it was specialized. Each part depended on every other part. And that dependence, which made the system so productive, also made it terribly, fatally fragile. The kings of the Late Bronze Age did not know this. They could not see the vulnerability built into the structure of their world. From where they sat, on golden thrones in palaces of cut stone, receiving the tribute of vassals and the gifts of brother kings, the system must have seemed eternal. Egypt had endured for millennia. Hatti had stood for centuries. Ugarit had flourished for generations. The palace economies of Mycenae managed their resources with meticulous care. The trade routes functioned. The bronze kept flowing. The letters kept travelling from court to court. It would all be gone within a generation. The first signs of trouble appeared not in the palace records but in the climate. In the year 2023, dendrochronologists published an analysis of ancient juniper timbers from Gordion, the later Phrygian capital in central Anatolia. Tree rings preserve a record of annual growing conditions, with narrow rings indicating drought and wide rings indicating plentiful rainfall. The juniper timbers from Gordion, carefully dated and cross-referenced, revealed something striking: an unusually severe and sustained dry period beginning around 1198 BCE and persisting through 1196 BCE. 3 consecutive years of intense drought, in a region already marginal for agriculture, would have devastated harvests and set in motion a cascade of consequences. But the evidence for drought and famine extends beyond tree rings. The cuneiform archives themselves speak of crisis. A Hittite queen, writing to Ramses II of Egypt, sent a letter that has survived in the Egyptian royal archives. Her words are stark: "I have no grain in my lands." This was not a polite request for a gift between royal houses. This was a cry for help. The Queen of Hatti, the queen of one of the greatest empires in the known world, a kingdom that controlled territory from the Aegean coast to the borders of Assyria, was admitting that her people were starving. Another letter, from a Hittite king to the king of Ugarit, describes the request for grain as a matter of life and death. The language is unambiguous. The Hittite Empire, the great power of Anatolia, the rival of Egypt, the builder of Hattusa, was unable to feed its own population. Egypt responded. Grain shipments from the Nile Valley were dispatched to Hatti, a remarkable act of international aid that underscores both the severity of the crisis and the depth of the alliance between the two powers. The peace treaty between Ramses II and Hattusili III had created not merely a cessation of hostilities, but a genuine partnership, and now that partnership was being tested by famine. But the grain shipments from Egypt, however generous, could not address the underlying problem. The Late Bronze Age palace system was built on surplus. The palaces collected grain and other agricultural products from their dependent territories, stored them in vast magazines and redistributed them to palace dependents, craftsmen, soldiers, priests, administrators. The system worked as long as the surplus was sufficient to meet demand. But what happened when the surplus failed? The answer, recorded in fragments across multiple archives, is that the system began to crack. One letter, found either at Ugarit or Hattusa, contains words that echo across 3,000 years. "There is famine in your house. We shall all die of hunger." The Hittite Empire by the late 13th century was already under pressure from within. The Casca peoples of the northern mountains had never been fully incorporated into the imperial system. They were pastoralists and raiders, dwelling in the highlands that bordered the Black Sea coast, and for generations they had harried the northern frontiers of Hatti. When the central power was strong, they were kept at bay. When the central power wavered, they descended from the mountains to plunder and burn. But the Casca were not the only source of instability. The Hittite Empire was a patchwork of vassal kingdoms, each ruled by a local dynasty bound to the great king by treaty. These vassals owed tribute and military service, But they also had their own interests, their own ambitions, their own resentments. When the great king was powerful and the harvests were good, the vassals remained loyal. When the great king was weak and the granaries were empty, the calculus of loyalty changed. Suppiluliuma II, the last effective king of the Hittite Empire, came to the throne around 1207 BCE. His reign would last roughly 3 decades, ending around 1178 BCE in circumstances that the surviving sources do not record. He was not a weak king. The inscriptions that survive suggest military campaigns and naval victories, an attempt to hold the empire together against mounting pressures. But he was a king presiding over a system that was beginning to fail. The internal instability of the Hittite Empire, the restive vassals, the raiding casca, the struggles over succession that had weakened the royal house in previous generations, made it vulnerable to the external shocks that were now beginning to accumulate: drought, famine, disruptions to trade, and something else, something that appears in the sources like a shadow on the horizon, barely glimpsed at first but growing larger with each passing year. Groups were moving, peoples were on the march. The Eastern Mediterranean was about to experience something it had not seen in centuries, a wave of migration and displacement that would sweep across the entire region, overwhelming the established powers and leaving destruction in its wake. But we are not yet at that moment. We are still in the years before the collapse, the years when the cracks beneath the plaster were just beginning to show. The palace economies of Mycenaean Greece across the Aegean from the Near Eastern crisis were not yet in open collapse, but they too were beginning to feel the strain. The Linear B tablets preserve no explicit mention of famine or drought. They are administrative records, not royal correspondence, and they concern themselves with the mundane details of palace management: allocations of bronze, rations of grain, lists of workers and livestock. But the very nature of the palace system made it vulnerable to disruption. Consider the bronze. The Mycenaean palaces controlled the production and distribution of bronze as a state monopoly. Bronzesmiths worked for the palace, received their rations from the palace, and delivered their products to the palace. The metal itself, the copper and tin required to make the alloy, came from overseas: copper from Cyprus, tin from the long routes that stretched back through Mesopotamia to the mountains of the east. If the trade routes were disrupted, the bronze would stop flowing. If the bronze stopped flowing, the smiths would have no metal to work. If the smiths had no metal, the palace would have no weapons, no tools, no elite goods to reward its followers and overawe its enemies. The tin trade was the most vulnerable link in the chain. Copper was available from Cyprus, a relatively short voyage from the Aegean. But tin had to come from far more distant sources: Afghanistan, possibly the Taurus Mountains of Anatolia, and had to pass through multiple intermediaries before it reached the Mediterranean. Any disruption to this long-distance trade, whether from drought, warfare, or political instability along the routes, would cut off the supply of tin and cripple bronze production throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. This was not a theoretical vulnerability. It was a structural weakness built into the very foundation of Bronze Age civilization. The system was efficient precisely because it was specialized. Each region produced what it was best suited to produce and traded for the rest. Cyprus produced copper, Egypt produced grain, the Aegean produced olive oil and textiles. The Levantine cities handled the trade. The system worked beautifully as long as all the parts continued to function. But it had no resilience, no redundancy, no capacity to absorb shocks. When one part failed, the consequences rippled outward. The population had grown, the climate had shifted, the harvests were failing, the tin was harder to obtain, the palaces were stretched thin, struggling to meet obligations that had been easy to fulfill in better years, and somewhere out beyond the horizon forces were gathering that would bring the whole edifice crashing down. The great kings did not know what was coming. The palace scribes continued to keep their records, tallying sheep and allocating oil, managing the routine business of administration, as if the world would go on forever. The merchants of Ugarit continued to trade, loading ships with copper and resin and sending them off across the sea. The Hittite king continued to write letters to his brother kings, requesting grain, negotiating treaties, maintaining the forms of diplomacy that had held the international order together for generations. But the system was more fragile than any of them realized. The same interdependence that had made it so productive, the long-distance trade routes, the specialized production, the interlocking alliances, had also made it catastrophically vulnerable. There was no margin for error, no buffer against disaster, no fallback position if the whole structure should fail, and the failure, when it came, would be total. We stand now at the threshold. The world of bronze and letters is still intact, still functioning, still producing its palace records and its diplomatic correspondence and its shipments of copper and tin. But the cracks are visible, the harvests are failing, the letters are growing desperate. The great kings are writing to one another not to exchange gifts and pleasantries, but to beg for grain. Somewhere beyond the horizon, peoples are moving. Somewhere in the Aegean or the Anatolian coast or the islands between, forces are gathering that will soon burst upon the established world like a storm. The sea peoples are coming, though they do not yet bear that name. The palace centres of Mycenae and Tyrins and Pylos are entering their final years, though their scribes do not yet know it. Ugarit has perhaps 2 decades left before the fires consume it, and the letter that was never sent is baked into permanence. Hattusa will burn, the international order will collapse, an age will end. But that is still to come. For now, the world of the Late Bronze Age is still here, diminished, stressed, uncertain, but still here. The trade routes are still open, the palaces are still functioning, the scribes are still pressing their style into clay. Let us pause here, at this moment of fragile equilibrium, and look around at what will soon be lost. The tin from Afghanistan, passing through 100 hands before it reaches the forge. The copper of Cyprus loaded into ships at Enkomi for the voyage west. The grain of Egypt, dispatched north to feed the starving population of Hatti. The merchants of Ugarit, calculating profits and arranging shipments, trusting in a world order that has stood for centuries. The palace scribes of Pylos, counting sheep and allocating bronze, unaware that in a few years their tablets will be baked hard by the fires of destruction, preserved for archaeologists to find 3,000 years later. This was a world of extraordinary sophistication and integration, a world that would not be matched again until modern times, and it was about to end, and it was about to end. But to understand how completely, we must first turn our attention to a place where the ancient world converged, a city perched on a low mound overlooking a plain that sloped gently down toward the Hellespont, where the waters of the Aegean narrowed into the swift current of the Dardanelles. This was the city the Greeks would call Ilion, the city the poets would sing of for 3,000 years. This was Troy. The mound is called Hisarlik today, a Turkish word meaning place of fortresses, and it rises from the northwestern corner of Anatolia like a worn tooth, layered with the debris of millennia. 9 distinct cities lie buried within it, one atop another, their walls and houses and hearths compressed into a vertical archive of habitation stretching back to the early Bronze Age. Archaeologists have numbered these cities from bottom to top, Troy 1 through Troy 9, but for our purposes, for the purposes of understanding the Bronze Age collapse, only one layer matters. It is called Troy 7, and it was built around 1300 BCE by people who knew that war was coming. The previous city, Troy 6, had been prosperous and proud, with massive walls of dressed limestone that still inspire awe in their ruined state. Those walls were constructed with a slight inward lean, what architects call a batter, and they enclosed a citadel dominated by large freestanding houses, the residences of an elite who had grown wealthy from their control of the straits. But Troy VI ended badly. Around 1300 BCE, the dating is imprecise, as Bronze Age dating so often is, the city was severely damaged. Earthquake, most likely. The great walls cracked. The fine houses collapsed. The old order came tumbling down. But the survivors did not abandon the site. They could not. Troy's position was too valuable, too strategic, too essential to the rhythms of trade that sustained the Bronze Age world, and so they rebuilt, and the city they built was different from the one that had come before. Troy 7 was not a city of spacious aristocratic houses. It was a city of crowded dwellings packed tightly within the repaired circuit of walls, small structures jammed together as if the inhabitants expected trouble and wanted everyone inside the fortifications. The citadel walls were reinforced with additional stone towers and mud brick breastworks, strengthening defences that had already been formidable. And most telling of all, the people of Troy 7 buried large storage jars, pithoi, the Greeks would later call them, directly into the floors of their houses, their rims level with the ground, their bellies sunk deep into the earth. This is what preparation for siege looks like in the archaeological record. You do not bury storage vessels in your floor unless you expect to need their contents when normal supply routes are cut. You do not crowd your population inside defensive walls unless you fear what lies beyond them. The people who rebuilt Troy after the earthquake knew something that we can only infer from the material remains. They knew their world was becoming dangerous. They were preparing to survive. What they could not know, what no one in the Late Bronze Age could have predicted, was that survival would prove impossible. Troy Severna was destroyed around 1180 BCE, and the destruction was violent. Archaeologists have found up to 3 feet of blackened debris covering the site, burned timbers, collapsed roofing, charred organic material compressed into a thick stratum of ash. Within this destruction layer lie arrowheads and what excavators describe as military paraphernalia, the hardware of warfare mingled with the carbonized remnants of a city consumed by fire. The siege provisions in the buried Pythoi did not save the inhabitants. The reinforced walls did not hold against whatever force came against them. Troy Severna died in flames, and it died around the same time that Mycenaean settlements on the Greek mainland were entering their own terminal decline. This chronological coincidence is crucial. For centuries, the destruction of Troy was understood through the lens of Homer's Iliad, the great expedition of the Greeks, the 1,000 ships, the 10-year siege, the wooden horse, and the sack of Priam's city. The Iliad gave the fall of Troy a narrative, a cast of characters, a moral framework. It made the Trojan War into a story about honour and wrath, and the caprice of gods. But the Iliad was composed at least 400 years after the events it claims to describe, filtered through generations of oral tradition, accumulated and elaborated by poets who added layers of mythology and heroic convention to whatever kernel of historical memory lay at the core. When we strip away the heroes and the gods, when we set aside Achilles and Hector and the rest, what remains is this: a prosperous Anatolian trading city, strategically positioned at a critical choke point, was violently destroyed around 1180 BCE, during a period when the entire eastern Mediterranean was convulsing with disruption. This does not mean the Trojan War never happened. It does not mean there was no conflict, no siege, no Greek involvement. The Iliad preserves genuine geographical memory, the catalogue of ships, the topography of the Troad, details that suggest real Bronze Age knowledge passed down through the long centuries of oral transmission. The Hittite texts, which we have already touched upon, mention a western Anatolian kingdom called Wilusa, in a region that corresponds to the later Troad, and they mention conflicts with a people called the Ahiawa, a name that may, scholars debate this endlessly, refer to the Mycenaean Greeks. There may well have been wars, raids, expeditions. The Late Bronze Age was violent. Conflict over trade routes and strategic positions was endemic. But what the archaeology shows us is something both simpler and more complex than Homer's epic. It shows us a city that was destroyed as part of a much larger pattern of destruction, a node in a network that was failing at multiple points simultaneously. The Greeks who may have attacked Troy, if Greeks they were, if attack it was themselves on the brink of collapse. The Mycenaean palaces would fall within decades of Troy Severna's destruction. If Agamemnon returned home in triumph, his triumph was short-lived. The civilization that sent him to Troy would not long survive his victory. The identity of Troy's destroyers remains genuinely uncertain precisely because so many candidates were in motion, so many peoples were on the move, so many cities were burning throughout the region in those terrible final decades of the Bronze Age. What we can say with certainty is what Troy meant to the system while it still stood. The city's position commanded the entrance to the Dardanelles, and the Dardanelles led to the Black Sea. To sail from the Aegean into the Black Sea, ancient ships had to navigate a strait roughly 40 miles long, narrow and swift-running, with currents that flow predominantly outward from the Black Sea toward the Mediterranean. The prevailing winds blow from the northeast for much of the year, which means that ships attempting to sail eastward against both wind and current faced a formidable challenge. They had to wait, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, until conditions permitted passage. A city positioned at the mouth of this strait enjoyed a captive market. Ships waiting for favourable winds needed water, food, repairs. Their crews needed provisions and entertainment. Merchants with cargo to move needed local knowledge, local contacts, local pilots familiar with the treacherous currents. Troy provided all of this. The city grew wealthy not primarily from manufacturing or agriculture, but from location, from its control of an essential waypoint on one of the Bronze Age's critical maritime routes, and what came through the Dardanelles, grain above all. The Black Sea region, the coasts of what are now Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, the Crimea, the northern shores of Anatolia, was one of the ancient world's great grain-producing zones. The Greek colonies that would later cluster around the Black Sea were established precisely to tap into this agricultural wealth, but the potential of the region was recognised far earlier. A ship that could navigate the straits could bring grain to markets throughout the Aegean and beyond. In years of abundance, this grain flowed westward and southward, feeding populations who could exchange their own products, bronze goods, textiles, oil, wine, for the staff of life. In years of scarcity, when drought parched the fields of Greece or the Levant or Egypt itself, the grain of the Black Sea became not a luxury but a necessity. This is why Troy mattered. This is why a city that modern visitors sometimes find disappointingly small. The citadel of Troy Tsveta covered perhaps 5 acres, a modest urban footprint by any standard, could command such attention, could accumulate such wealth, could persist in human memory for 3 millennia as the site of history's most famous war. Troy was a choke point, and choke points are always contested. The city did not need to be large. It needed only to be in the right place at the right time, and it was, until it wasn't. When Troy Severna fell, the network lost a node. Ships that had relied on Troy's services now faced a ruined citadel and a devastated plain. The grain route was not necessarily closed, the Dardanelles remained navigable, but the infrastructure that had supported the trade was damaged. And this was only one point of failure among many. The system that had sustained the Late Bronze Age was failing everywhere, simultaneously, catastrophically. Troy's destruction was not the cause of the collapse, nor was it merely a symptom. It was a moment in a process, one fire in a conflagration that was consuming the entire eastern Mediterranean. The world that Homer would later sing of, already passing into memory, already becoming the stuff of legend, was entering its final years. The poets would remember Troy for the heroes who fought and died beneath its walls, but the reality, insofar as we can glimpse it through the archaeological haze, was both more mundane and more terrifying. Troy fell because everything was falling. The system was coming apart. And now we must speak of the destroyers, not of Troy specifically. We have already acknowledged how uncertain the identity of Troy's attackers remains, but of the great wave of destruction that swept across the eastern Mediterranean in the final decades of the 13th century and the opening years of the 12th. We must speak of the Sea Peoples. The name is modern, a scholarly convenience imposed on a phenomenon that the ancients themselves struggled to describe. The Egyptians, who faced these peoples and fought them and recorded the encounter, did not use the term Sea Peoples. They named individual groups, listed them carefully, described their appearance and their arms and the manner of their arrival. But the composite term serves a purpose, because it captures something essential about what happened. Peoples came by sea, or peoples associated with the sea, peoples who moved across the maritime world of the Mediterranean in numbers and with destructive force that the established powers had never before confronted. We know of the Sea Peoples primarily from Egyptian sources, and the most important of these sources stands today in the ruins of a mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile near the modern Egyptian city of Luxor. The temple is called Medinet Habu, and it was built by Ramses III, the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, as a monument to his achievements and a guarantee of his eternal memory. The walls of Medinet Habu are covered with inscriptions and reliefs depicting the pharaoh's military campaigns, and among these are the most detailed records we possess of the Sea Peoples and the threat they posed to Egypt itself. The date is approximately 1190 BCE, the 8th year of Ramses III's reign, and the crisis has reached its climax. On the massive second pylon of the temple, carved deep into the stone, the great inscription tells the story. The foreign countries, the text uses a word that can mean islands or coastal regions, made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms, and then the inscription delivers a terrible inventory. From Hatti, Code, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia on, being cut off at one time. Pause here and absorb what is being claimed. Hatti, the Hittite Empire, one of the great powers that had dominated the Bronze Age world for centuries. Kode, a region in southeastern Anatolia, Carchemish, the great fortress city on the Euphrates that controlled the crossing point between Anatolia and Mesopotamia, Azawa, the confederation of western Anatolian kingdoms that had long been a power in its own right, sometimes allied with the Hittites and sometimes at war with them, Al-Ashir, Cyprus, the copper island, the essential supplier of the metal that made bronze possible. All of these, the inscription claims, were cut off at one time, not weakened, not raided, not forced into temporary retreat, cut off. The very phrase suggests severance, amputation, the removal of entire territories from the body of the civilized world. The Egyptians were not inventing this. We know from other sources, archaeological evidence, the silence of archives that suddenly cease, the burned ruins of cities that were never rebuilt, that the Hittite Empire did in fact collapse in the final decades of the 13th century. Hattusa, the capital, was destroyed and abandoned. The palace archives end. The great kings of Hatti vanish from the historical record. Whatever the sea peoples were, whatever they did, the Egyptians were not imagining a threat. They were recording a catastrophe that had already consumed their rivals and now threatened them directly. The Medinet Habu inscriptions name 5 groups as comprising the main confederation: the Peleset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denian, and the Weshesh. Scholars have spent over a century attempting to identify these peoples, to pin them to known locations, to trace their origins. The Peleset are the most confident identification. They appear to be the Philistines, who would later settle on the southern coast of Canaan and give their name to Palestine itself. The Cheka may have settled at Dor on the Palestinian coast. An Egyptian story from the following century, the tale of Wenamun, describes Dor as a Cheka port. The Shekelesh have been tentatively connected to Sicily, the Sherden, another group mentioned in earlier Egyptian texts, to Sardinia. The Denian may relate to the Danaans, a Homeric name for the Greeks, but all of these identifications are speculative to varying degrees, dependent on linguistic similarities that may or may not be meaningful, and none of them tells us what we most want to know. Where did these peoples come from, and why did they suddenly appear in such devastating force at this particular moment? The temple reliefs offer a clue, though it is a clue that raises as many questions as it answers. Among the battle scenes depicting Egyptian forces engaging the sea peoples by land and by sea, the artist carved images that had not appeared in earlier Egyptian military art: ox-drawn carts loaded with women and children. These are not warriors riding to battle. These are families in migration. The sea peoples, or at least some of them, were not merely a raiding force. They were a people on the move, bringing their dependents with them, seeking not plunder but settlement. The carts suggest displacement, desperation, the cutting of ties to wherever they had come from. These were not pirates raiding and retreating to a home base. These were refugees armed for war, or perhaps survivors of collapsing societies who had no home base left to return to. This is where the mystery deepens, and where the nature of the sea peoples becomes genuinely uncertain. Were they the cause of the collapse? The invaders who swept down upon flourishing civilizations and destroyed them? Or were they a consequence of collapse, refugees from civilizations that were already failing, displaced by drought and famine and political disintegration, driven outward by forces beyond anyone's control? Modern scholarship increasingly suggests that the distinction may be false, that the sea peoples were both cause and consequence, that they were drawn from the very civilizations that were collapsing, that they became raiders precisely because the structures that had sustained them had failed. Consider the geography implied by the Medinet Habu inscriptions. The sea peoples are described as having made their conspiracy in their islands, before sweeping southward through Anatolia and the Levant. The islands in question are presumably in the Aegean, perhaps including Crete and Cyprus, perhaps the countless smaller islands that dot the eastern Mediterranean. But the Aegean in the late 13th century was dominated by Mycenaean civilization, the same Mycenaean civilization whose palace centres at Mycenae, Tiryns and Pylos were themselves on the verge of destruction. If the sea peoples included Aegean islanders, they may have included people fleeing the same catastrophe that was overwhelming the Mycenaean mainland. The Mycenaeans were not only victims of the collapse, elements of Mycenaean society may also have been participants in the destruction of their neighbours. The same logic applies elsewhere. The Hittite Empire, before its fall, had controlled or dominated much of Anatolia. When that control failed, when the central authority at Hattusa could no longer maintain order or defend its vassals, What happened to the populations of the western Anatolian coast? What happened to the sailors and traders and warriors who had lived under Hittite suzerainty, who had depended on the Hittite system for stability and livelihood? Some of them may well have become sea peoples themselves, joining the Great Migration out of desperation, contributing to the destruction of the very order that had previously sustained them. This cascade of failure, collapse begetting displacement, displacement begetting raiding, raiding begetting further collapse, is what modern scholars sometimes call a systems collapse. It is not a single cause with clear effects, but rather a feedback loop in which multiple factors reinforce one another, in which each failure increases the probability of further failures, in which the whole structure comes apart because none of the individual pieces can survive without the others. The Sea Peoples were agents within this process, but they were also products of it. They did not descend from outside the Bronze Age world, they emerged from its dissolution. The Onomasticon of Amenope, an Egyptian text dated to approximately 1100 BCE, a full century after Ramses III's battles with the Sea Peoples, provides a fascinating glimpse of what happened after the crisis passed. This document, a kind of encyclopedic list of peoples and places, names the Shurden, Cheka, and Peliset among the inhabitants of the southern Levantine coast. The Sea Peoples, or at least some of them, had settled. They were no longer on the move, no longer raiding and destroying. They had found homes in the ruins of the old order and were building something new. The Peliset, or the Philistines, would become the most famous of these settlers, establishing a pentapolis of 5 cities along the coastal plain of Canaan: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. These cities would endure for centuries, their distinctive material culture gradually merging with the Canaanite and Israelite traditions around them. The Philistines would become the great adversaries of the Israelites in the biblical narrative, the enemies of Samson, and the warriors who slew Saul on Mount Gilboa, the giants who sent Goliath to challenge David. But before they were the biblical villains, before they were anything that the Hebrew scriptures would remember, they were refugees from the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse, desperate people seeking a place to live after everything they had known had burned. The Egyptians stopped them. That is the crucial point, the reason Medinet Habu matters, the reason Ramses III's inscriptions tell us what we know about the Sea Peoples. Egypt was the one great power that did not fall. The same forces that destroyed Hatti, that shattered Mycenaean, that burned Ugarit and ended the palace economy of the Aegean, those same forces broke against the organised defences of the Egyptian state. But the Egyptians did not stop the Sea Peoples easily, and they did not stop them without cost. The battle accounts at Medinet Habu describe a coordinated military response, a mobilisation of land and naval forces, a deliberate strategy of ambush and counterattack. Ramses III had warning. He knew the Confederation was coming. He knew they had destroyed the lands to his north, and he prepared. The 8th year of Ramses III saw the crisis reach Egypt itself. The Sea Peoples had established a camp in Amur, somewhere in the Levantine region, perhaps the Amurru territory that had once been contested between Hittites and Egyptians, and from there they launched both land and sea assaults against Egyptian territory. The land forces moved south along the coastal plain, the traditional invasion route into Egypt from the north, but simultaneously a fleet sailed for the mouths of the Nile, seeking to force entry into Egypt itself, to bring the destruction that had consumed the north directly to the heartland of the surviving great power. Ramses III responded with what the inscriptions describe as a hidden fleet, vessels positioned at the Nile mouths, waiting in ambush. When the Sea People's ships arrived, expecting perhaps to find an undefended coastline, they found instead the Egyptian navy ready and waiting. The inscriptions and reliefs depict the ensuing battle with a propagandistic enthusiasm typical of Egyptian royal monuments: capsized ships, drowning men, the enemies made as those who exist not. The Egyptian archers on the defending vessels are shown pouring arrows into the enemy ships at close range. Men are depicted falling into the water, grasped by the limbs of other drowning figures, pulled down into the churning sea. The pharaoh himself, of course, is shown in heroic scale, personally leading the defence, wielding the bow, smiting the enemies of Egypt in the manner of every pharaoh since time immemorial. We should not take the propagandistic elements at face value. Ramses III did not personally command the fleet or kill thousands of enemies with his own hands. But beneath the royal rhetoric lies a historical fact. The the Sea People's naval assault was defeated. The Confederation's fleet did not force the Nile mouths. The ambush succeeded. The threat from the sea was turned back. The land forces fared no better. The Egyptian army, still organised, still loyal, still supplied by a functioning agricultural economy, met the Sea People's land assault and defeated it as well. The images at Medinet Habu show the aftermath. Prisoners being led before the pharaoh, their arms bound, their distinctive feathered or horned headdresses marking them as foreigners. The Confederation had been broken, Egypt had survived. But survival is not the same as victory in any meaningful long-term sense. Egypt stopped the Sea Peoples, but Egypt could not restore the world that the Sea Peoples had helped to destroy. The trade networks were shattered, the tin supplies were disrupted, the palace economies that had been Egypt's trading partners were gone, replaced by ruins and refugees. Ramses III's triumph at the Delta was a defensive success, not a recovery of the old order. Egypt would endure, would remain recognisably Egyptian for another millennium and more. But the Egypt that survived the Sea Peoples was a diminished Egypt, an Egypt turning inward, an Egypt that would never again dominate the Levant and contest with great powers for mastery of the eastern Mediterranean world. And so, the Sea Peoples pass from history, or rather they pass from recorded history in the forms that preserved them in the Bronze Age archives. The Pelasets settled and became Philistines. The Cheka settled and are mentioned once, in the Tale of Wenamun, and then vanish from our sources. The Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, their individual fates are lost to us, merged into the general obscurity of the Dark Age that followed the collapse. They had been, for a few terrible decades, the most dramatic actors on the stage of Bronze Age history, the destroyers named by name in royal inscriptions. And then they were gone, absorbed into the changed world they had helped create, leaving behind only their names carved in stone at Medinet Habu and the ruins of the cities they had burned. But we are moving too quickly now. The battles at the Delta, Ramses III's great defence, the settlement of the Philistines. These come at the end of the crisis, the final act of a tragedy that had been unfolding for decades. Before we can fully understand the scope of what was lost, we must return to the north, to the cities that burned before the Sea Peoples ever reached Egypt. We must follow the collapse as it happened, city by city, kingdom by kingdom, archive by archive falling silent. We must go to Ugarit, in the final season of its existence, where a merchant prince was composing a letter that would never be sent. The city of Ugarit sat on a small hill overlooking the Mediterranean, some 40 miles south of the mouth of the Orontes River, roughly 12 miles north of modern Latakia in Syria. It was not a great empire. It commanded no vassal states, fielded no armies that conquered distant lands, erected no colossal monuments to proclaim eternal dominion over the world. Ugarit was something else, a city of merchants, scribes and sailors, a place where the products of a dozen civilizations passed through warehouses and quays, where Akkadian and Hurrian and Egyptian and Hittite and the city's own distinctive alphabetic script all jostled together in the archives of the royal palace. Its harbour, the port of Minet el Beida, received ships from Cyprus and the Aegean, from Egypt and the Anatolian coast. Its merchants dealt in copper and tin, in textiles and wine, in the purple dye extracted from the murex shells that littered the beaches of the Levantine coast. For centuries, Ugarit had thrived on its position at the crossroads, extracting wealth from the passage of goods between the great powers, paying tribute to the Hittite overlords who guaranteed its security, maintaining the careful diplomatic balance that allowed a small kingdom to survive among giants. By the reign of its last king, Amurapi, that balance had become impossible to maintain. We know Amurapi's name because his letters survived. Not many. A handful of tablets among the thousands discovered in Ugarit's archives, but enough to preserve his voice across 32 centuries. He came to the throne sometime around 1215 BCE, a contemporary of the last Hittite king Suppiluliuma-Sut, inheritor of a city that had been prosperous and stable for generations. He could not have known when he assumed the throne that he would be the last king Ugarit would ever have. He could not have known that within a generation his city would be a ruin, his palace burned, his kingdom erased so completely that even its name would be forgotten, until French archaeologists rediscovered it in 1928. What Amurapi did know, by the final years of his reign, was that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The letters that survive from Ugarit's last season are not the correspondence of a confident ruler managing the affairs of a prosperous kingdom. They are the desperate communications of a man watching the world collapse around him, reaching out to allies who could not help, begging for assistance that would not arrive in time. They are voices from the edge of an abyss, preserved only because the fire that destroyed the city baked the clay tablets hard enough to survive. One of these letters, catalogued by modern scholars as RS 18-147, was addressed to the king of Al-Ashir, the copper-rich island kingdom we know as Cyprus. The king of Al-Ashir had apparently written to Hammurabi asking for assistance, requesting that Ugarit send forces to help defend against some unspecified threat. Hammurabi's reply has survived, and it is a document of terrible eloquence. "My father," he writes, the conventional diplomatic address of a junior king to a senior ally, "behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." The identity of these enemies is not specified. Hammurabi does not name them the way Egyptian sources name the sea peoples, does not enumerate the tribes and confederations that threatened his realm. To him, they were simply the enemy. A force that had appeared from the sea, burned his cities, inflicted evil upon his land. The details were presumably known to both correspondents and did not need to be stated. What mattered was the devastating reality of the attack and Hammurabi's complete inability to respond to it. "All my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti," Hammurabi explains, "and all my ships are in the land of Luka." The land of Hatti, the Hittite heartland in central Anatolia. The land of Luka, the southwestern coast of Anatolia, roughly modern Lycia. Hammurabi's military forces were deployed far from home, fulfilling the vassal obligations that Ugarit owed to the Hittite Empire, defending Hittite interests while Ugarit itself lay exposed. The irony is almost unbearable. Ugarit paid tribute to the Hittites in exchange for protection. When the crisis came, Ugarit's own forces were away protecting the Hittites, and the Hittite Empire had no forces to spare for the defense of Ugarit. The system that was supposed to guarantee security had instead guaranteed vulnerability. Thus, Hammurabi concludes, the country is abandoned to itself. 7 enemy ships, the letter records, had inflicted much damage upon Ugarit. 7 ships. Not a vast armada, not the full weight of the Sea People's Confederation, but a raiding squadron, perhaps a few hundred warriors at most. And these 7 ships had been enough to burn cities, to do evil things, to leave a king with no response but a letter explaining why he could not help an ally when he could not even help himself. The country is abandoned to itself. These are not the words of a king who expects rescue. They are not the words of a ruler who believes the crisis will pass, that reinforcements will arrive, that the enemy will withdraw and normalcy will return. They are the words of a man who has understood with terrible clarity that the system which sustained his kingdom has failed, that the great powers can no longer protect their clients, that small kingdoms at the crossroads are now simply prey for whoever has the ships and the warriors to take what they want. But Hammurabi did not give up. He could not. He was a king, and kings are obligated to try, even when trying is hopeless. He wrote to the Hittite viceroy at Carchemish, the great trading city on the Euphrates that served as the administrative centre for Hittite authority in Syria. Carchemish was closer than the Hittite capital at Hattusa. Perhaps the viceroy could send forces. Perhaps the Hittite military resources in Syria could be mobilized before it was too late. The invaders, Hammurabi reported, had captured Rashu, a port barely 5 miles from Ugarit itself. Their advance forces were moving toward the city. The situation was no longer a matter of raids on outlying settlements. The enemy was at the gates. "May my lord send me forces and chariots," Hammurabi pleaded, "and may my lord save me from the forces of this enemy." The viceroy did send troops. We know this from other fragments of correspondence. Hittite forces were dispatched toward Ugarit, marching south to relieve the besieged kingdom, fulfilling at last the obligations of the overlord to the vassal. But time, which had never favoured the Bronze Age powers in this crisis, betrayed them once more. When the Hittite relief force arrived, Ugarit had already been sacked. The city that greeted them was no longer a city at all. The palace was burned, the temples were destroyed, the archives, those vast collections of tablets recording the treaties and transactions and religious rituals of centuries, were scattered through the ruins, some preserved by the very fires that had destroyed the buildings around them. The merchants were gone, fled, or killed. The The scribes who had recorded the alphabetic texts that made Ugarit famous were dead or dispersed. The harbour at Minet el Beida, which had received the ships of a dozen nations, was empty of all traffic, except perhaps the distant sails of departing raiders. And somewhere in the ruins, archaeologists would eventually discover a letter that had never been sent. This tablet, found in the remains of a kiln where tablets were fired to harden them for long-term storage, describes the situation in Rashu, the captured port 5 miles from the city. It details the establishment of the enemy beachhead, the advance toward Ugarit, the desperate circumstances that prompted its composition. The letter was placed in the kiln to be fired, presumably for urgent dispatch to some ally who might still help, but the city fell before the kiln could complete its work, before the hardened tablet could be retrieved and handed to a messenger, before the plea could begin its journey to recipients who might have responded. The fire that destroyed Ugarit completed the firing of the tablet. The message was preserved by the very catastrophe it was meant to avert. And so it sat in the ruins for over 3,000 years, waiting for French archaeologists to unearth it in the 20th century, a letter written in desperation, addressed to no one because it never left the ruined city, preserved only as a record of the final moments before the world went dark. What can we say about these letters that the letters themselves do not say more eloquently? They are the voices of real people confronting genuine catastrophe. Hammurabi was not a figure in an epic, not a character crafted by a poet to illustrate the fall of cities. He was a man, a king, a husband and father probably, someone who woke each morning to the weight of responsibilities he had inherited and could not escape. He watched ships appear on the horizon. He received reports of cities burning, of people fleeing, of an enemy that could not be negotiated with, could not be bought off, could not be appeased by the ordinary mechanisms of Bronze Age diplomacy. He wrote letters because writing letters was what kings did, because the diplomatic system that had sustained the Bronze Age world required communication, required the endless exchange of words and gifts and obligations that bound the great powers and their clients together. And the letters did nothing. They did not bring reinforcements in time. They did not persuade distant powers to divert forces from their own crises to save Ugarit. They preserved for us the evidence of what Hammurabi knew and felt in those final months, but they could not save his city or his people. The country is abandoned to itself. This is perhaps the essential truth of the Bronze Age collapse, stated with devastating simplicity, by a king who understood that he was witnessing the end of an era. The system that had sustained the prosperous, interconnected world of the late Bronze Age, the system of great powers and vassal states, of tribute and protection, of trade networks and diplomatic marriages, of tin convoys and grain shipments, and the constant circulation of goods and ideas across 1,000 miles of sea and land, that system had abandoned its components. The parts could no longer rely on the whole. Each city, each kingdom, each people faced the crisis alone. Ugarit fell sometime around 1180 BCE, though the precise year is debated among scholars. Some evidence suggests it was destroyed by the 8th year of Rameses III, placing the destruction in 1178 BCE, making Ugarit one of the casualties of the very Sea People's Confederation that Egypt would shortly defeat at the Delta. Other analyses suggest slightly earlier dates. The uncertainty is fitting. The collapse did not proceed according to a neat timeline that modern historians can easily reconstruct. It was chaos, spreading chaos, and chaos does not keep reliable records. What we can say is that Ugarit never recovered. The site was not rebuilt, the merchants did not return, the scribes did not reconstitute the archives. The city that had thrived for centuries at the crossroads of civilizations became a tell, a mound of accumulated debris covering the remains of a dead city, eventually even losing its name as the local population forgot what had once stood there. When the Frenchman Claude Schaeffer began excavations in 1929, he did not know that he had rediscovered Ugarit. The identification came later, as the tablets emerged and scholars recognized the city's name in its own records. In a sense, Ugarit's archive is its monument, far more than any temple or palace could be. The tablets preserve not just administrative records and literary texts, but the voices of the last generation, speaking across millennia about what it felt like to watch the world end. Hammurabi's letters are not great literature. They are bureaucratic correspondence, diplomatic communications following established forms, the routine paperwork of international relations. But they are also human documents, records of fear and desperation, and the stubborn refusal to accept the inevitable, and they move us in ways that the grandest royal inscriptions never could. To the north and west, in the heartland of Anatolia, the Hittite Empire was dying. It did not die the way Ugarit died, in fire and sudden violence, with enemies at the gates and frantic letters pleading for help. The death of Hattusa, the Hittite capital, was stranger, more deliberate, in some ways more disturbing. The city was not conquered, it was abandoned. Hattusa lay in the bend of the Kızılırmak River, the ancient Halys, in north-central Anatolia. At its height, it was one of the great cities of the Bronze Age world, its walls enclosing more than 1,800 hectares, a vast space, far larger than contemporary cities, encompassing the temples and palaces and administrative buildings of an empire that had contested with Egypt for dominion over the Levant. The Hittites had fought Rameses II to a standstill at Kadesh, had negotiated history's first known peace treaty, had exchanged princesses in marriage with the pharaohs, had maintained a correspondence with their equals among the great powers in the confident language of kings who expected to be treated with respect. By around 1180 BCE, Hattusa was empty. The archaeological evidence from the city's final phase tells a peculiar story. There are signs of destruction by fire, burned buildings, collapsed roofs, the usual markers of catastrophe. But there are no mass graves. There are no bodies lying in the streets struck down by invaders. There are no caches of valuables hastily hidden in walls or buried in courtyards, the treasures that people hide when they expect to return but fear looters in the meantime. The temple storehouses, which should have contained the gold and silver vessels, the gilded spears, the booty accumulated by generations of successful warfare, these storehouses were empty when the archaeologist reached them. The Hittite royal family, the elites, the state apparatus, they had already gone. What does it mean for a great power to abandon its capital? The Hittites did not simply flee in panic, leaving their possessions behind. They organized, they planned, they removed the valuables, archived or destroyed the records they did not want to leave, and departed in something resembling order. The royal archives appear to have been deliberately buried, perhaps for safekeeping, perhaps to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The city was not stripped bare by looters after its fall. It was systematically emptied by its own rulers before they left, and then it burned. The burning probably came later, after the evacuation, and the perpetrators were likely the Kaskians, the Phrygians, and the Bridges, peoples who had long pressed against Hittite borders, who had been held at bay by Hittite military power, and who moved into the vacuum when that power withdrew. But by the time they arrived to burn Hattusa, they were burning a ghost city, a capital already abandoned by the people who had built it. Suppiluliuma, the last great king of the Hittite New Kingdom, probably witnessed this evacuation, may have ordered it. He came to the throne around 1207 BCE, the son of Tudhaliya IV, and he ruled through the final crisis of the Hittite state. His reign saw naval campaigns in Cypriot waters, battles against the mysterious enemies pressing against Hittite territories, the desperate struggle to maintain imperial cohesion as the system collapsed around him. And then he vanishes. Unlike the Egyptian pharaohs whose deaths and successions are usually recorded, Suppiluliuma simply disappears from the historical record. There is no account of his death, no description of his tomb, no succession narrative explaining who came after him. Some scholars have suggested that he had at least one successor, perhaps a son named Tudhaliya Vep, but this is speculation based on fragmentary evidence. The truth is that we do not know what happened to the last Hittite king. He ruled, he fought, he struggled to preserve his empire, and then the records stop. The silence is itself a kind of testimony. The Hittite state was, above all else, a literate state, a bureaucracy that recorded its actions in thousands of tablets, that maintained diplomatic correspondence with every major power in the Bronze Age world, that documented its treaties and its rituals and its administrative decisions with the obsessive thoroughness of a civilization that believed in the power of written words. For that state to stop writing, for the records to simply end, tells us that something fundamental had broken. The scribes were gone, or dead, or had no functioning administration to record. The empire that had sustained them had ceased to exist. Around 1190 BCE, the tablets from Hattusa fall silent. No more diplomatic correspondence, no more administrative records, no more royal inscriptions. The voice of the Hittite Empire, which had spoken so confidently for centuries, stopped speaking and would not speak again. What had caused the collapse? The tree ring evidence from the region tells part of the story. The years 1198, 1197 and 1196 BCE saw severe drought, 3 consecutive years of failed rainfall, of withered crops, of streams running dry and wells falling. For an agricultural society dependent on annual harvest to feed its population and supply its armies, 3 consecutive years of drought was a catastrophe. Grain shipments from Egypt, which had once supplemented Hittite harvests, were themselves under strain as the wider crisis intensified. The vassal states were restless, the Cascadians were raiding, the sea peoples were threatening the coasts, and now the rains had failed. But drought alone does not explain why the Hittites abandoned their capital rather than defending it. Other peoples have endured droughts without evacuating their cities. The answer must lie in a broader calculation, a recognition by the Hittite leadership that the city could no longer be held, that the resources needed to defend it were no longer available, that the empire's collapse had reached a point where concentration in the capital was no longer the safest strategy. Better to take the treasures, take the royal family, take what could be saved, and withdraw to some more defensible position. Where that position was, what became of the evacuees, whether they survived as a coherent community or dispersed into the general chaos of the collapse, these questions have no certain answers. The Hittite Empire, which had once contested with Egypt for mastery of the known world, had ceased to exist. Its capital was a ruin, burned by enemies who arrived after the Hittites had already departed. Its king had vanished into the historical darkness. Its vast archive of tablets would lie buried and forgotten for over 3,000 years until German archaeologists began excavating the site in 1906 and recognized, with growing astonishment, that they had found the lost empire that Egyptian and biblical sources had tantalizingly mentioned. For our purposes, standing at the midpoint of the collapse, the fall of Hattusa marks a structural turning point. The Bronze Age system had been built in part on the balance of great powers, Egypt, Hatti, Babylon, Assyria, whose rivalries and alliances structured the international order. With Hatti gone, that balance was destroyed. One of the pillars had fallen. The others would not be able to sustain the weight alone. Beneath the political catastrophes, the burning cities, the fleeing kings, the vanishing empires, lay a slower, more fundamental crisis. The people of the late Bronze Age world were facing something that no treaty could address, no army could defeat, no diplomatic marriage could resolve. The rains were failing. Modern science has given us tools that the scribes of Ugarit and Hattusa did not possess. Pollen cores extracted from lake sediments, tree rings preserving annual records of rainfall and temperature, cave deposits recording atmospheric conditions with extraordinary precision. These records do not speak with the personal anguish of Hammurapi's letters, but they tell their own story, and it is a story of sustained environmental stress that the Bronze Age systems were not equipped to handle. In the Sorek cave, located in the Judean hills of Israel, scientists have extracted speleothem records, mineral deposits formed by dripping water, that preserve over 150,000 years of precipitation data for the northern Levant. This is an almost unimaginably long climate record, spanning multiple ice ages and interglacial periods, recording the rhythm of wet and dry cycles across geological time, and within this vast archive, the period around 1200 BCE stands out as a sharp, sustained decline in rainfall. Researcher Brandon L. Drake, examining this and other climate evidence, has documented what he terms a mega drought, striking the eastern Mediterranean between approximately 1200 and 850 BCE. This was not a single bad year, not even 3 consecutive bad years like the drought that stressed the Hittites in the 1190s. This was a sustained climatic shift lasting roughly 350 years, a transformation of the regional environment that would have made traditional agricultural practices increasingly difficult or impossible. Further confirmation comes from Tel Twani, an archaeological site in coastal Syria, where Brandon Kaniewski and his colleagues have conducted detailed pollen studies. The pollen record at Tel Twani preserves a history of vegetation change that closely tracks human agricultural activity. When agriculture thrives, certain cultivated and weed species appear in abundance. When agriculture fails, Wild species characteristic of abandoned or degraded land take their place. The pollen from Tel Twaini tells a story of agricultural collapse beginning around 1200 BCE and persisting through the following centuries, a dark age written in the language of plants. The period from roughly 1200 to 850 BCE, Karnievsky's team concludes, was characterized by prolonged drought conditions in the Mediterranean belt of Syria. Drier climate conditions beginning in the late 13th or early 12th century BCE correspond precisely with the time frame of the late Bronze Age collapse and the subsequent Dark Age. This is not coincidence. This is cause and effect, environmental stress cascading through human systems. But we must be careful here, as historians always must be careful with monocausal explanations. The drought did not single-handedly destroy the Bronze Age world. Droughts had struck before and civilizations had survived them. The Hittite Empire had endured climate variability for centuries. Egypt, dependent on Nile floods rather than rainfall, had weathered countless local droughts without collapse. What made the late 13th century different was not the environmental stress alone, but the interaction between environmental stress and all the other stresses that were simultaneously overwhelming the system. The palace economies of the late Bronze Age were optimized for abundance, not scarcity. They collected surplus grain from good years, stored it in great storehouses, and redistributed it to specialists who did not grow their own food, the scribes and soldiers and craftsmen and priests who made the palace civilizations function. This system worked brilliantly as long as there was surplus to collect, but when the surplus failed, when 2 or 3 or 5 consecutive harvests came up short, the palace had nothing to redistribute. The specialists could not be fed, the armies could not be supplied. The trade networks that depended on agricultural surplus as a medium of exchange lost the commodity that made exchange possible. And here the interconnectedness that had been the Bronze Age system's greatest strength became its fatal weakness. The Hittites, facing drought in their own territories, had depended on grain shipments from Egypt to supplement their supplies. This dependence was well documented in diplomatic correspondence. Hittite kings requesting Egyptian grain, Egyptian pharaohs negotiating the terms of assistance, the movement of food across the international system as a normal feature of great power relations. But Egypt too was under stress. Egypt's agricultural surplus was not infinite. Egypt had its own population to feed, its own armies to supply, its own temples and palaces to maintain. When the crisis deepened, Egypt could no longer afford to ship grain to distant allies. The termination of Egyptian grain shipments to the Hittite Empire was not an act of hostility. It was triage. Egypt chose to feed its own people when there was not enough food to feed everyone. This was rational, even necessary from an Egyptian perspective. But for the Hittites, who had come to depend on those shipments, the cut-off was potentially catastrophic. A system that had been manageable with Egyptian support became unmanageable without it. And so the famine chain spread, link by link, from one corner of the Bronze Age world to another. Drought led to crop failures. Crop failures led to food shortages. Food shortages led to the breakdown of palace redistribution systems. The breakdown of redistribution led to social unrest, to unpaid soldiers, to desperate populations willing to follow anyone who promised survival. The desperate populations became refugees, and the refugees became the wandering peoples who appeared on the borders of still functioning states, demanding entry or taking by force what they could not obtain by request. The sea peoples themselves, as we have noted, were likely products of this chain as much as they were its agents. Mycenaean Greeks, Anatolian populations, Cypriot refugees, peoples displaced from their own collapsing homelands, seeking new lands to settle, new resources to exploit because the lands and resources they had known no longer supported them. They did not destroy the Bronze Age world because they were uniquely destructive or uniquely hostile. They destroyed it because they were desperate, because they had nowhere else to go, because the world that had sustained them had already failed. The climate data, then, does not explain the collapse, but it illuminates the conditions under which the collapse became possible. The Bronze Age system was resilient to shocks. It had survived wars and famines and epidemics before. What it could not survive was the simultaneous failure of multiple components under sustained stress. The drought was one stressor among several. The sea peoples were another. The interruption of the tin trade was a third. The breakdown of diplomatic trust among the great powers was a fourth. Each of these stresses might have been manageable alone. Together they were unsurvivable. The archives of Ugarit, the abandoned streets of Hattusa, the climate records from Sorek Cave and Tel Toini, these are different kinds of evidence, speaking different languages, preserved by different processes, but they tell the same story, the story of a system pushed beyond its capacity to adapt. Hammurabi, writing his desperate letters in Ugarit's final season, did not know about pollen cores or tree rings. He knew only that enemies were at his gates, that his allies could not help him, that the country was abandoned to itself. The deeper causes of his predicament were invisible to him, as they are often invisible to people caught in the midst of historical catastrophe. We, from our vantage point 3,000 years later, can see the patterns he could not see. We can trace the drought in the scientific records. We can map the movements of peoples in the archaeological evidence. We can read the letters and tablets that survived and reconstruct, imperfectly but increasingly clearly, the shape of the crisis that overtook his world. This is not consolation. Knowledge does not heal the wounds of the past, but it is understanding, and understanding is what we owe to the people who lived through the collapse, who struggled and suffered and sometimes survived, whose voices reach us still across the silence of the dark age that followed. The Hittite capital was burning, or would burn soon. The cities of Syria and Cyprus and the Levantine coast were falling one by one. The Mycenaean palaces, but that is the next part of our story, and we must not move too quickly. For now, we remain in the moment of collapse, in the summer of a year around 1180 BCE, when the rains did not come, when the ships appeared on the horizon, when the letters went out and the reinforcements did not arrive, when the Bronze Age world, which had seemed so permanent, so prosperous, so magnificently interconnected, began its long slide into darkness. The Mycenaean palaces, we have delayed their reckoning long enough, for while Hattusa burned and Ugarit fell and the Syrian coast descended into chaos, the world across the Aegean was suffering its own catastrophe, quieter in some ways, lacking the dramatic final letters that Hammurabi left for us to discover, but no less total in its consequences. The collapse of Mycenaean Greece would prove, in some respects, the most complete of all the Bronze Age destructions. Not merely the fall of cities, but the erasure of literacy itself, the forgetting of how to write, the plunge into a darkness so absolute that 4 centuries would pass before Greece would produce another written record of any kind. We must understand what was being lost. The palace states of Mycenaean Greece, Mycenae itself, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, Medea, and perhaps a dozen others of varying importance, represented the westernmost extension of Bronze Age civilization. They were newer than Egypt, younger than the Hittite kingdom, latecomers to the great power system that had governed the eastern Mediterranean for centuries, but by the 13th century they had become integral participants in that system, trading with Cyprus and the Levant, exchanging gifts and letters with the pharaohs, their pottery appearing in context from the Nile Delta to the coast of Syria. Mycenaean merchants sailed the routes that the Uluburan ship had followed. Mycenaean warriors perhaps fought among the allies of the Hittites or raided among the peoples who would become the Sea Peoples. The world of Bronze Age Greece was not separate from the world we have been describing. It was part of it, connected by the same networks of trade and diplomacy, dependent on the same flows of copper and tin and luxury goods that sustained the palace economies of the East. The palace at Mycenae sat behind its massive walls of fitted stone, the Lion Gate with its carved guardians watching the approach road, the tholos tombs of its early kings, including the great beehive structure that later Greeks would call the treasury of Atreus, testifying to centuries of accumulated wealth and power. The citadel commanded the plain below, its rulers overseeing a territory that extended across much of the northeastern Peloponnese. Within the walls, scribes worked in the same linear B script that their counterparts at Pylos and Thebes employed, recording the same bureaucratic minutiae that sustained palace redistribution economies throughout the Bronze Age world. Inventories of grain and oil, lists of workers and their rations, counts of livestock and weapons and textiles. The system was the same. The vulnerability was the same. Tiryns lay nearby, another Cyclopean fortress, its walls even more massive than those of Mycenae, galleries and chambers built into the stonework itself, a palace complex perched behind defences that must have seemed impregnable to the people who sheltered behind them. Medea, smaller but still formidable, controlled its own portion of the Argive plain. Thebes dominated Boeotia to the north, its palace yielding Linear B tablets that spoke of the same administrative concerns, the same careful accounting of resources and obligations. And on the western coast of the Peloponnese, the palace at Pylos, the best preserved of all the Mycenaean administrative centres, the richest source of Linear B documents, ruled over Messenia, its archive rooms packed with the clay tablets that would eventually tell us so much about the final days of the Bronze Age world. These were not cities in the later Greek sense. They were palace complexes, administrative centres around which populations clustered, their economies organised around the collection and redistribution of agricultural surplus, their power structures dependent on the continued functioning of complex bureaucratic systems. The scribes who wrote in a Linear B were servants of these systems, trained specialists who recorded the movements of goods and people that kept the palace economies functioning. They were not poets or philosophers or independent merchants. They were accountants, their tablets the spreadsheets and inventory lists of a vanished world. When the palaces fell, the scribes had no purpose. When the scribes had no purpose, writing ceased. The connection between literacy and institutional power was absolute. The destruction horizon struck these centres within a generation. Fire destroyed multiple Mycenaean sites around 1200 BCE, the flames burning hot enough to bake the clay tablets that scribes had never intended to be permanent records. The tablets were meant to be recycled each year, their contents summarised and transferred, the clay moistened and reused for the next season's accounts. The fires preserved them accidentally, the same way that the fires at Ugarit preserved Amurapi's desperate correspondence. We read the final records of the Mycenaean palaces because catastrophe baked them into permanence, but not all the destructions were simultaneous. Some sites suffered fire damage in the 13th century, rebuilt, and continued functioning for decades before the final collapse. Mycenae itself was damaged by fire, perhaps around 1250 or somewhat later, only to recover and continue as a major centre until a second destruction around 1190 BCE, a destruction from which there would be no recovery, no rebuilding, no continuation of palace life. After that second burning, Mycenae ceased to be what it had been. People continued to live among the ruins, squatters in the shells of great buildings, but the palace system was finished, the scribes were gone, the redistribution economy had collapsed, and the cultural tradition that had produced the citadel and its treasures simply ended. At Medea, the evidence suggests violent assault. 50 arrowheads were found scattered in the destruction debris, clustered in patterns that speak of combat rather than accident, of defenders falling at their posts or attackers pressing through breached defences. The arrowheads are small facts, metal points that survived when flesh and wood did not, but they humanise the destruction in ways that burned stones cannot. Someone was shooting at someone else. Someone was trying to kill, and someone was dying. The administrative collapse that we trace in missing tablets and abandoned scribal traditions was accompanied by the immediate physical violence of warfare. Arrows flying, walls breached, people cut down in their homes or in the streets, or at the gates they were trying to defend. Who was attacking? The evidence does not tell us. The Mycenaean sites, unlike Ugarit, did not leave letters describing the identity of their enemies. We have no Amurapi of Mycenae writing frantically to allies about 7 enemy ships, or 20 more sighted offshore. The destroyers of the Mycenaean palaces are anonymous, their identities lost with the scribal tradition that might have recorded them. They may have been other Mycenaeans. The collapse may have been, in part, internal, palace against palace, faction against faction, a civil war or series of civil wars that consumed the competitive states of the Greek mainland. They may have been outsiders, raiders from the north or from the sea, peoples moving through a collapsing landscape in search of plunder or settlement. They may have been subject populations rising against palace control, the farmers and herders who had grown the grain and tended the flocks that the palaces redistributed, now refusing to render that surplus to rulers who could no longer protect them. The collapse may have been all of these things at once, different factors dominating at different sites, the general chaos of a failing system expressing itself in 100 different local catastrophes. What we know is that the palace system died. Not merely individual palaces, not merely individual cities, but the entire organisational structure that had sustained Bronze Age civilization in Greece. The great walls remained standing, Cyclopean masonry does not burn, but the institutions they protected were gone. The scribal tradition that had recorded palace affairs for centuries simply ceased. The administrative apparatus that had organised labour and distributed surplus vanished. The trade networks that had connected the Mycenaean world to Egypt and the Levant and Cyprus and Anatolia broke, and the flow of goods that had sustained elite culture dried up. Bronze became scarcer because tin was no longer arriving from the east. Luxury goods disappeared because the palace economies that had commissioned and consumed them no longer existed. The palace at Pylos provides the most detailed evidence of the end. Unlike Mycenae, which suffered multiple destructions and partial recoveries, Pylos was destroyed once, suddenly and completely, the fire burning hot enough to bake over 1,000 Linear B tablets into permanence. The archive rooms of the palace preserved the administrative records of its final year, the last season of a civilization that did not know it was living through its final season, or perhaps, as the tablets suggest, suspected exactly that. The tablets from Pylos record emergency preparations. Storage was increased, supplies laid in beyond normal levels, as if the palace administrators expected a siege or a disruption of normal agricultural cycles. Access to the palace complex was restricted, checkpoints established, the free movement of people limited in ways that suggest security concerns rather than normal administrative routine. These are not the records of a palace going about its ordinary business. These are the records of a palace preparing for trouble, organising defences, marshalling resources against a threat that the scribes did not describe directly, but that their preparations make unmistakably clear. Most striking are the tablets that record the disposition of military forces. Rowers were being posted, not merely assigned to ships, but stationed at specific locations, their numbers carefully recorded, their positions along the coast mapped in bureaucratic detail. Watchers were being sent to the coast, observers posted at vantage points to scan the sea, to watch for approaching ships to provide early warning of whatever threat the palace authorities expected from the water. The coastal defence tablets from Pylos read as the last bureaucratic gasp of a civilization sensing catastrophe and trying with the tools it had available to prepare. The tools were not enough. The watchers on the coast may have seen the ships coming, may have sent runners back to the palace with warnings, may have watched helplessly as whatever force was approaching made landfall. The rowers at their stations may have tried to intercept the enemy vessels or may have fled inland when they realised the scale of the threat. The tablets do not tell us what happened after they were written. They tell us only that preparations were being made, that the palace bureaucracy was functioning until the very end, that the administrative system that had managed Pylian society for generations was still producing records in its final days, still trying to impose order on a situation that was spiralling beyond control, and then fire. The tablets baked, the palace burned, the scribes died or fled or were enslaved. The Linear B tradition, which had preserved administrative records across the Mycenaean world for centuries, simply stopped. No more tablets were written because no institutions remained that required tablets, because the entire system of palace-centered bureaucracy had collapsed, because the specialized knowledge of the scribes, who may have constituted no more than 1% of the population, an educated elite serving palace needs, became useless when the palaces no longer existed to employ them. The inability to write did not kill Mycenaean civilization. The death of Mycenaean civilization killed writing in Greece. The darkness that followed was absolute in ways that the collapse in other regions was not. In Egypt, as we shall see, the Old Kingdom endured, weakened but functioning, its scribal traditions continuous, its historical memory intact. In the Levant, cities fell but others survived, and the peoples who settled in the ruins, including the Philistines, whom we know as the Peliset from Ramses III's inscriptions, would build new societies that preserved at least fragments of Bronze Age culture. Even in Anatolia, where the Hittite kingdom was utterly destroyed, smaller states emerged from the wreckage, Luwian-speaking successor kingdoms that preserved aspects of Hittite religious and artistic tradition. But in Greece, the break was total. The centuries that followed the collapse, from roughly 1200 to 800 BCE, the period that scholars call the Greek Dark Ages, produced almost no written records, no monumental architecture, no art that could compare to what had come before. Population declined drastically. Settlement patterns changed. The number and size of inhabited sites fell to a fraction of what it had been during the Palatial period. Greece forgot how to be Greece. The Mycenaean world, with its palaces and treasuries and scribes, its connections to the great civilizations of the East, Its participation in the international system that had linked Egypt to Hatti to Babylon to the Aegean, all of this was lost. The Greeks who emerged from the Dark Ages, who began to build temples and write again in the 8th century BCE, using an alphabet borrowed from the Phoenicians rather than the Linear B syllabary of their ancestors, had no direct memory of the Mycenaean world. They had legends, stories of Agamemnon and Odysseus and Achilles, of Troy and the heroes who had fought there. But these legends, however many authentic details they may have preserved, were not history. The people who told them did not know that Mycenae had once been the centre of a palace economy, that scribes had recorded the distribution of grain and the posting of rowers in a writing system that their descendants could no longer read. The Linear B tablets, when they were finally discovered by archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries, required decades of work to decipher, because the language they recorded, an early form of Greek, had been written in a script that no one had read for over 3,000 years. This was what the collapse meant in Greece, not merely the destruction of cities which can be rebuilt, not merely the death of kings who can be replaced, but the forgetting of how to write, the breaking of cultural continuity, the plunge into an illiteracy so complete that even the memory of having been literate was lost. The Mycenaean palaces burned, and 4 centuries of silence followed. When history resumed, it had to begin again from the beginning. We have moved through the destruction horizon now. Ugarit has fallen, Hattusa has burned. The Mycenaean citadels lie in ruins, their tablets baked by fire, their scribes scattered or dead, their watchers on the coast overwhelmed by whatever force they had been posted to observe. The great powers of the Bronze Age, the international system that the Uluburun ship had served, the diplomatic network that had linked royal courts from the Nile to Mesopotamia to the Aegean. This system has collapsed. City after city, kingdom after kingdom, the interconnected world has come apart, its trade routes severed, its palaces destroyed, its populations displaced into the mass movements that appeared at the borders of surviving states as the Sea Peoples. But one great power remained. One kingdom had not fallen. Egypt, the oldest of the Bronze Age civilizations, the most powerful and most wealthy, still stood behind its deserts and its river, its pharaoh still ruling from Thebes and Memphis and Pyrameses, its armies still intact, its bureaucracy still functioning, its scribal traditions continuous across millennia. Egypt had survived catastrophes before, the collapse of the Old Kingdom, the chaos of the intermediate periods, invasions by Hyksos and Nubians and Libyans. The pharaohs had always endured. The Nile had always flooded, bringing life to the narrow strip of cultivated land along its banks. The temples had always stood. The gods had always been served. Now Egypt faced the greatest test of its long history. The Sea Peoples were coming. They had swept through Anatolia and Cyprus, through Syria and the Levantine coast, destroying everything in their path, absorbing refugees and survivors into their growing mass, moving south with their families and their possessions loaded onto ox carts, their warriors marching alongside, their ships paralleling the coast, a combined land and sea migration of displaced peoples seeking a new homeland. They had written to Amurapi demanding grain and water. They had burned Ugarit when Amurapi could not or would not provide it. Now they were approaching the borders of Egypt itself, the last great prize, the richest and most powerful kingdom that remained, the only force that might be capable of stopping them. The pharaoh who faced them was Ramses III, second king of the 20th dynasty, already battle-tested, already proven in combat, already a veteran of the wars that the collapse had brought to Egypt's borders. He had come to the throne in 1184 BCE, inheriting a kingdom that was stable but not at peace, wealthy but surrounded by danger. The 19th dynasty had ended in confusion and short reigns, the great days of Ramses Thecht, who had ruled for 67 years, who had faced the Hittites at Kadesh, who had built monuments throughout Egypt, now decades in the past. Ramses III modelled himself on his great predecessor, took the same throne name, built in the same monumental style, sought to restore Egypt to the grandeur it had known in the previous century. He could not know that he would be the last pharaoh to wield genuine imperial power, the last to command the resources of a fully functioning Bronze Age state. His first great challenges came from the west. Libyan tribes, peoples from the deserts beyond Egypt's western frontier, had been pressing against the delta for generations, seeking access to the rich agricultural lands along the Nile, raiding when they could, settling when they could not be stopped. In the 5th year of his reign, Ramses III faced a major Libyan incursion, a coalition of tribes that penetrated deep into the western delta, threatening the stability of the kingdom. He marshalled his forces and defeated them, driving them back into the desert, taking thousands of prisoners, commemorating his victory on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. It was a significant engagement, a real test of military capability, and he passed it. Egypt could still defend itself. 6 years later, in the 11th year of his reign, the Libyans came again, a second major incursion, perhaps encouraged by reports of chaos in the eastern Mediterranean, perhaps driven by the same drought conditions that were destabilizing populations throughout the region. Again, Ramses III met them in battle. Again, he was victorious. Again, he commemorated his triumph in stone, the inscriptions at Medinet Habu recording the numbers of enemies killed and captured, the booty taken, the glory accruing to the pharaoh who defended Egypt against its foes. But the Libyans, however dangerous, were a known threat, a familiar enemy, peoples from a familiar direction whom Egyptian armies had fought for centuries. What was coming from the east was something different. The Sea Peoples Coalition, the Peliset and the Cheka and the Shekelesh and the Denyen and the Weshesh, peoples whose names Ramses III would record on the walls of Medinet Habu, peoples who had destroyed the Hittite kingdom and burned the cities of the Syrian coast. This was a threat of a different magnitude entirely. This was not a raid or an incursion. This was a migration, a mass movement of displaced populations seeking new lands, bringing their families and possessions, intending not merely to plunder, but to settle. They had already demonstrated what they could do. The ruins stretching from Hattusa to Ugarit testified to their capabilities. They were not going to be stopped by half measures. Ramses III understood this. The intelligence reaching him from the north would have been fragmentary but alarming. Reports from Egyptian merchants and diplomats, from refugees fleeing the destruction, from the last communications with client states and trading partners before those states went silent. The Hittites had been allies, or at least not enemies, for over 70 years, since the peace treaty between Ramses II and Hattusili III. Now the Hittites were gone. The cities of Cyprus that had traded copper with Egypt were burning or had burned. The Syrian coast, where Egyptian influence had waxed and waned for centuries, was in chaos or under enemy control. The Sea Peoples were approaching the eastern delta, the gateway to Egypt, the route that invaders from Asia had always followed. The pharaoh began to prepare. According to the inscriptions at Medinet Habu, he equipped his frontier in Zai, Jahi, the Egyptian term for the coastal region of southern Palestine and Syria, the buffer zone between the Nile Delta and whatever forces approached from the north. He stationed troops forward, creating a defensive perimeter beyond Egypt's core territory. He prepared a war fleet, not merely transport vessels for carrying troops along the coast, but purpose-built warships for combat at sea. He raised a large army of infantry, mobilizing the military resources of a state that had been accumulating wealth and power for 3,000 years. And he developed a strategy. The Sea People's strength lay in their mobility, their ability to move by both land and sea, their coordination of naval and ground forces that had overwhelmed the defenders of Cyprus and the Syrian coast. They had shown at Ugarit that they could appear by sea in numbers sufficient to threaten even well-defended cities. They had shown throughout Anatolia that their land forces could march through territory that other armies had considered defensible. Ramses III understood that meeting them in open water where their ships could maneuver freely, or allowing them to choose their point of attack on the coast, would surrender the initiative to the enemy. He needed to control the engagement. He needed to force them to fight on his terms, in a location of his choosing, under conditions that favoured Egyptian tactics and Egyptian strengths. The Nile Delta provided the answer. The great river divided into multiple branches as it approached the Mediterranean, creating a network of channels and waterways that no one knew better than the Egyptians themselves. These channels were narrower than open sea, limiting the ability of enemy ships to manoeuvre, restricting their formations, channeling them into killing zones where Egyptian archers on shore could rain arrows down upon them. The strategy was not merely naval, it was combined arms, using land-based forces in coordination with the fleet, positioning troops along the banks of the delta channels to engage enemy ships with concentrated missile fire, while Egyptian vessels moved in for close combat. The Egyptians prepared their ships. They used at least 3 types of vessels: warships for direct combat, galleys for rapid manoeuvring, barges that could carry troops and supplies and serve as stable platforms for archers. They positioned lookouts at the masts of their ships, men perched high above the decks to spot the enemy fleet approaching, to provide early warning, to guide the Egyptian vessels into position. They placed slingers in crows' nests, a tactical innovation that appears for the first time in Egyptian art in the reliefs of Medinet Habu, ranged combatants positioned above the enemy, able to rain projectiles down on ships that came within range. The preparations were thorough, methodical, the work of a military establishment that had been defending Egypt for centuries and intended to go on defending it for centuries more. The war would be decided in two major battles, the inscriptions tell us. First, a land engagement, fought somewhere between the eastern frontier of the Delta and the approaches of southern Palestine, and then a naval combat, when the enemy fleet penetrated into the Nile Delta itself. The land battle came first, Egyptian infantry meeting the Sea People's ground forces before they could reach the Delta, blunting the overland advance, forcing the coalition to rely on its ships for the final assault on Egypt. And then the decisive engagement, the battle that would determine whether the last great Bronze Age power would survive or fall, the naval battle in the Delta, where Ramses III's preparations would be tested against enemies who had destroyed everyone else who had tried to stop them. The moment approaches, the ships are gathered, the archers are positioned on the shore, the lookouts scan the horizon from their elevated positions, watching for the enemy sails that must appear, that will appear, that are even now approaching across the waters from the fallen cities of the north. Ramses III has done everything that can be done, his forces are deployed according to his strategy, his frontier is equipped, his fleet is ready. This is the climactic battle of the Bronze Age collapse, the one engagement where the defenders won, where the seemingly inexorable tide of destruction was turned back, where a civilization that might have fallen instead survived. What happened in the channels of the Nile Delta, in the 8th year of Ramses III's reign, would shape the history of the Mediterranean for centuries to come. We will witness that battle. But for now, we pause at its threshold, with the Egyptian forces in position and the Sea Peoples approaching, with the fate of the ancient world hanging in the balance, with the last great question of the Bronze Age collapse about to receive its answer. The sails appeared on the northern horizon in the summer of the 8th year of Ramses III's reign, around 1175 BCE by modern reckoning. They came not as a scattered raiding force, but as a fleet, ships moving in formation, the combined naval strength of peoples who had already broken every power that had tried to resist them. The Hittites were gone. The cities of the Syrian coast were ash. The Mycenaean palaces had burned. Cyprus had been ravaged. And now this confederation, the Peliset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, brought their ships into Egyptian waters, into the channels of the Nile Delta, where Ramses III waited for them. The Egyptian lookouts saw them first, the men posted high on the masts of the waiting fleet, their voices carrying across the water to alert the commanders below. The archers on the shore tightened their grips on their bows. The slingers in the crow's nest checked their ammunition. Along the banks of the Delta channels, Egyptian infantry stood in formation, shields raised, spears ready, their positions chosen to maximize the crossfire that would be directed at any vessel that entered the killing zone. The Egyptians had prepared for this moment with everything their civilization could muster. Now the moment had arrived. What followed was the first major naval battle recorded in human history. Not the first naval battle ever fought, certainly, but the first one depicted in sufficient detail that we can reconstruct its tactics and its outcome. The reliefs at Medinet Habu, Ramses III's mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, preserve this engagement in carved stone, scene after scene of combat rendered with a precision that allows us to see the ships, the warriors, the weapons, the desperate struggle in the confined waters of the river mouths. The ancient artists carved what they saw or what they were told by men who had seen it. The enemy vessels entering the channels, the Egyptian response, the chaos of close combat, the bodies in the water. This is history preserved in limestone, propaganda certainly, but propaganda that required a victory to celebrate, and the Egyptians had their victory. The Sea People's ships entered the Delta channels expecting to find what they had found elsewhere. The enemy they could overwhelm with their numbers and their ferocity, a coast they could ravage, a civilization they could break. What they found instead was a trap. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu described the Egyptian strategy in vivid terms. Those who had assembled before them on the sea, the full flame was in their front before the river mouths, and a wall of metal upon the shore surrounded them. The full flame in their front, Egyptian fire, perhaps fire pots or some other incendiary weapon, used to spread panic among the enemy crews. A wall of metal upon the shore, the massed Egyptian forces lining the banks, their weapons catching the light, their arrows already knocking as the enemy vessels came within range. The Sea Peoples had sailed into a channel from which there was no easy escape, into waters where their superior numbers could not be deployed, where their ships were confined and vulnerable and exposed to fire from multiple directions at once. Ramses III had positioned a stockade of lances along portions of the shore, a defensive measure designed to impede enemy ships that might try to land troops or escape the killing zone by beaching. The lances jutted from the water's edge like the teeth of some vast trap, forcing the Sea People's vessels to remain in the channel, to absorb the punishment the Egyptians were delivering, to fight under conditions that favoured Egyptian tactics at every turn. The archers on shore began their work. Arrow after arrow flew from the bank, a continuous barrage directed at the enemy decks, at the warriors crowded on the Sea People's ships, at the rowers trying to manoeuvre in the confined space. The slingers in the crow's nests added their own rain of projectiles, stones arcing down from above to strike helmets and shields and unprotected flesh. And then the Egyptian ships moved in. The reliefs show the engagement with remarkable clarity. Egyptian vessels approaching the enemy fleet, their own archers firing from the decks, their marines preparing for boarding actions. The combat became close and brutal, ship against ship in the narrow channel, men fighting hand to hand across gunwales slick with blood and river water. The Sea People's warriors were formidable. These were the same fighters who had destroyed Ugarit, who had helped bring down the Hittite Empire, who had terrorized the entire eastern Mediterranean. But in the channels of the Delta, they could not bring their full strength to bear. Their ships could not maneuver freely. They could not form the formations that might have overwhelmed the Egyptian fleet by sheer numbers. They were pinned, surrounded, taking fire from every direction, and the tide of the battle began to turn against them. The reliefs show what happened to those who fell. Egyptian sailors reaching over the sides of their vessels to haul drowning men from the water, not to rescue them but to capture them, pulling enemies up by their hair, by their clothing, dragging them onto Egyptian decks as prisoners. Other reliefs show the dead floating in the river, the bodies of Sea People's warriors drifting in waters that had become a grave. The inscription continues: they were dragged, overturned, and laid low upon the beach, dragged, pulled from the water from their capsizing ships, from whatever wreckage they clung to as their vessels went down, overturned, their ships capsizing under the weight of the Egyptian assault, under the fire that fell upon them from shore and from the crow's nests of the Egyptian fleet. Laid low upon the beach, the survivors who made it to land only to face the Egyptian infantry waiting there, the spears and swords of soldiers who had no intention of letting any enemy escape. The victory was decisive. The reliefs show the aftermath: bound captives, captured ships, the piled bodies of the enemy dead. The Sea People's fleet had been destroyed in the delta channels, broken by a strategy that used terrain and tactics to neutralize their strength, that transformed their approach into a disaster from which there was no recovery. Ramses III had done what no other ruler of the Late Bronze Age had managed to do. He had stopped them. The confederation that had swept everything before it, that had unmade civilizations older than memory, had finally met a defense it could not break. But what had Egypt won? The immediate answer was survival. The Nile Delta remained Egyptian. The Sea Peoples did not burn Memphis or Thebes, did not destroy the temples that lined the great river, did not bring down the pharaonic state the way they had brought down the palaces of Greece and the cities of Syria and the empire of the Hittites. In the summer of 1175 BCE, in the channels where the Nile met the Mediterranean, Ramses III had preserved the last great Bronze Age civilization. The cost, however, would become clear only in the decades that followed. For the Sea Peoples did not simply vanish after their defeat. Some were killed, others captured, but many survived. The survivors of the land battle, the warriors from ships that escaped the Delta trap, the families who had been travelling with the Confederation seeking new lands to settle. These displaced peoples had to go somewhere, and in the aftermath of the Egyptian victory they settled along the coastal Levant. The Peliset, the people whose name would eventually become Philistine, then Palestine, established themselves in what the Bible would call the 5 cities of the Philistines: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. The Chika settled at Dor on the coast of what is now Israel. Others dispersed along the littoral, founding communities that would persist for centuries, transforming the ethnic and cultural landscape of the region. Egypt had won the battle but lost the peace. The effort required to defeat the Sea Peoples had been enormous, a mobilization of resources that strained even the great wealth of the pharaonic state. And the world that existed before the Sea Peoples arrived, the interconnected system of trade and diplomacy that had defined the Late Bronze Age, was gone regardless of who won individual battles. There were no more Hittites to exchange letters with. Ugarit was not going to send another ship laden with copper and tin and grain. The Mycenaean palaces would never again place orders for Egyptian gold. The network that had sustained all of these civilizations had collapsed, and Egypt's victory preserved Egypt but could not restore what had been lost. The decades after the Battle of the Delta witnessed Egypt's long retreat from its former prominence. Ramses III himself would reign for another 30 years after his great victory, but the latter portion of his rule was marked by troubles that the triumph over the Sea Peoples could not prevent. Economic difficulties mounted. The supply of precious metals that had flowed through the old trade networks dried up. Workers on royal projects, including the tomb builders at Deir el-Medina, went unpaid for months at a time. An unprecedented failure of the pharaonic state to meet its obligations. The great expansive Egypt of Ramses II, the Egypt that had contested with the Hittites for control of Syria, the Egypt that had sent ambassadors and merchants and armies across the entire eastern Mediterranean, was contracting, pulling back, conserving what it had rather than reaching for more. And then came the conspiracy. In 1155 BCE, in the 32nd year of his reign, Ramses III was murdered. The plot originated in his own household, among his own family, a harem conspiracy documented in extraordinary detail in a papyrus now housed in Turin, the judicial papyrus that preserves the trial records of those who were caught and punished. The secondary wife Tiye, mother of the prince Pentuer, conspired to assassinate the pharaoh and place her son on the throne instead of Ramses III's designated successor, the future Ramses IV. The conspirators included officials of the harem, military officers, and palace administrators, men who had access to the pharaoh, who could approach him without raising suspicion, who knew his routines and his vulnerabilities. They struck, and they succeeded in killing him. Modern forensic examination of Ramses III's mummy has confirmed what the ancient texts implied. Computed tomography scans revealed a deep wound across the pharaoh's throat, a cut made by a sharp blade, a knife drawn across the neck with enough force to sever the tissue down to the bone. This was no gentle death, no peaceful passing of an old king who had lived a long and glorious life. This was murder, violence in the inner chambers of the palace, the great victor of the Delta dying with his throat cut open by men he had trusted. The conspiracy failed in its larger purpose. Pentuer did not become pharaoh. The loyalists prevailed, and Ramses IV succeeded his father as intended. 28 conspirators were tried and executed for their roles in the assassination. The names of some are preserved in the judicial papyrus: Pebekamen, Mastasuria, Panhaiboni, Panuk, Pentuer, Peri. Men whose treachery ended in death. Pentuer himself, the prince for whom all this had been done, was permitted the privilege of taking his own life rather than being executed publicly, a small mercy for a prince whose ambitions had destroyed him. Tiye's fate is not recorded, but it cannot have been pleasant. The assassination caused a succession crisis that accelerated the decline already underway. Ramses Thopha did take the throne, but his legitimacy was shadowed by the violence that had brought him there, and his reign lasted only 6 years. Other sons of Ramses III would rule after him, a long sequence of pharaohs all named Ramses, the 20th dynasty sliding toward exhaustion, but none of them would restore Egypt to the position it had held before the collapse. The decades following the great pharaoh's death saw continued contraction. Egyptian influence in the Levant weakened. The copper mines at Timna in the Sinai passed out of Egyptian control. The monuments grew smaller and less ambitious. The resources available to the crown diminished year by year. This was not a collapse in the manner of Mycenaean or Hatti or Ugarit. Egypt did not burn. The temples were not destroyed. The dynasty continued. The Nile still flooded each year to renew the black soil of the floodplain. But the Egypt that emerged from the Bronze Age collapse was a diminished thing, a great power that had become merely a regional power, a civilization that survived but could no longer project strength beyond its own borders. The victory over the Sea Peoples had preserved the core, the Nile Valley, the Delta, the sacred sites. But it could not prevent the systemic contraction that was the true nature of the collapse. The Bronze Age had been built on interconnection, on trade routes that spanned continents, on diplomatic marriages and shared technologies, and the movement of tin and copper and gold across thousands of miles. When that system failed, when the networks broke, when the palace economies collapsed, even the survivors found themselves diminished. Egypt's long retreat was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow diminishment, a multi-decade process of reduction that illustrated the real character of the age. Not one apocalyptic moment, but a sustained compression, a world growing smaller and poorer and more isolated year by year. The dark age that settled over the eastern Mediterranean in the wake of the collapse would last for centuries. In Greece, the transformation was most stark. The Mycenaean palace world had been literate, centralized, connected. Scribes recording the movements of goods in Linear B, palaces redistributing resources according to complex administrative systems, ships carrying Mycenaean pottery to every corner of the Bronze Age world. By 1150 BCE, all of that was gone. The palaces had burned and would not be rebuilt. The scribes had scattered or died, and with them died the knowledge of how to read and write the script they had used. Greece entered a period of profound impoverishment, a time of contraction so severe that later Greeks would have no memory of what had come before, no knowledge that their ancestors had built palaces and kept records and traded with Egypt and the Hittites. The Mycenaean world became legend, then myth, then the half-remembered stories that Homer would eventually shape into the Iliad and the Odyssey. The depopulation was dramatic. Archaeological surveys suggest that the population of Greece fell by as much as 90% in the centuries following the collapse. Cities emptied. Whole regions were abandoned. The elaborate ceramic styles of the Mycenaean period gave way to simpler, cruder pottery. A visible decline in craftsmanship that archaeologists can trace through the layers of sites across the Greek world. There is no evidence of long-distance trade from this period. The tin routes that had connected Greece to Central Asia were severed. The copper supplies from Cyprus were no longer accessible. The agricultural production that had supported the palace populations declined along with everything else. Greece became a land of small villages and scattered farms, of chieftains ruling over a few dozen families, of subsistence agriculture replacing the surplus economy that had made civilization possible. The community of Nicoria in the Peloponnese tells the story in archaeological terms. During the Bronze Age, Nicoria had been a substantial town, part of the Mycenaean network, connected to the wider world. Around 1150 BCE, the Bronze Age settlement was abandoned. Its inhabitants fled or died, its buildings fell into ruin, its streets grew over with weeds. For 75 years, the site stood empty. Then, around 1075 BCE, people returned. But the Nicoria that re-emerged was nothing like what had come before. Instead of a town, there was a small cluster of villages. Instead of hundreds of inhabitants, perhaps 40 families. Instead of craft specialists and scribes and administrators, there were farmers and herders scratching a living from abundant land that no one else wanted anymore. The people of Dark Age Nicoria may have been materially poorer than their Bronze Age predecessors, but they had something those predecessors had lacked in their final years. Enough. Enough land for everyone, enough pasture for their animals, enough food to survive if not to flourish. The collapse had been catastrophic for the Mycenaean elites, for the palace administrators and the merchant princes and the warrior aristocrats. For the ordinary farmers who survived, it may have looked more like liberation, from taxes and corvée labour and the demands of a redistributive economy that took their surplus to feed the palace. The Dark Age was dark, but it was also lived in. People adapted. People survived. People built new communities on different foundations. What these communities lacked, however, was everything that we associate with civilization. There were no cities. There was no writing. The Linear B script disappeared entirely, and Greece would remain illiterate for 4 centuries until the Phoenician alphabet was adopted around 800 BCE. There was no monumental architecture, no palaces, no temples, nothing larger than a chieftain's hall. There was no specialised craft production, no merchant class, no professional soldiers or bureaucrats. The interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age, where a ship could carry cargo from a dozen different civilizations, where scribes wrote in multiple languages, where kings married each other's daughters and exchanged gifts of gold and lapis lazuli and worked ivory. That world was gone, and for the people living through the Dark Age, it was gone so completely that they did not even remember it had existed. The darkness was not uniform, however. There were exceptions, places where some spark of the old world persisted, communities that maintained connections when everything around them had fragmented. Lefkandi on the island of Euboea was one such place. Archaeological excavations at Lefkandi in the 1980s overturned the traditional picture of the Greek Dark Ages, revealing a community that was far wealthier and more connected than anyone had expected. The site dates primarily to around 1900 BCE, the heart of the Dark Age, a time when most of Greece was impoverished and isolated. But Lefkandi was different. The excavations revealed a monumental building, not a palace in the Mycenaean sense, but a large apsidal structure, roughly 50 metres long, built to impress and to endure. Near this building lay a cemetery filled with graves that contained extraordinary objects, jewellery, bronze vessels, worked gold, and luxury items that could only have come from far away. Some of these goods originated in Cyprus, others came from Egypt, some showed connections to the Levant. In the depths of the Greek Dark Age, the people of Lefkandi were still trading, still connected, still part of something larger than themselves. The graves at Lefkandi suggest that wealth was concentrated among a small elite, warrior chieftains and their families, who had somehow maintained access to the maritime trade routes that everyone else had lost. One famous burial contained a man and a woman interred together, the man cremated and his ashes placed in a bronze amphora that appears to be of Cypriot manufacture, the woman laid out beside him with gold jewellery covering her body. Nearby lay the skeletons of horses, sacrificed at the burial, a gesture of aristocratic display that would have been recognisable in the Mycenaean age, and that foreshadowed the heroic ethos of Homer's later epics. These were not the subsistence farmers of Nicoria. These were people who had preserved some fragment of the old ways, some connection to the networks that had defined the Bronze Age world, but Lefkandi was the exception, not the rule. For most of the Aegean, the centuries between 1150 and 900 BCE were precisely what the traditional narrative describes, a time of profound contraction, when the achievements of the Bronze Age were forgotten, and the foundations of the later Greek world were laid in conditions of material poverty and cultural simplicity. The Greeks who emerged from the Dark Age in the 8th century BCE, who adopted the Phoenician alphabet and began to write again, who built the first stone temples and started to establish colonies across the Mediterranean, had no memory of their Mycenaean ancestors. They knew legends of a heroic age, stories of great kings and mighty warriors, tales of a city called Troy that had been besieged and burned. But the linear B tablets, the palace economies, the intricate bureaucracies that had catalogued every sheep and every jar of oil and every bronze tripod owed to the gods, all of that was gone, beyond recovery, beyond even legend. The Mycenaean world had vanished so completely that when the tablets were finally discovered by modern archaeologists, it took decades to realise that the script was Greek at all. This was what the collapse looked like when it was complete. Not a single moment of destruction, but a centuries-long process of forgetting. Not an apocalypse, but an unwinding. The systems that had sustained Bronze Age civilization, the trade routes, the palace economies, the diplomatic networks, the shared technologies, had been so intricate, so interdependent, that when they failed completely. The individual components could not survive on their own. The Hittites could not simply scale back to a smaller empire. They vanished entirely. Ugarit could not retreat to subsistence agriculture. It burned and was never rebuilt. The Mycenaean palaces could not adapt to reduced circumstances. They collapsed and took literacy with them. Egypt alone survived, diminished but intact, because Egypt had something the others lacked: the Nile. The annual flood renewed the soil each year without requiring the complex trade networks that other civilizations depended upon. Egyptian agriculture was not dependent on imported tin or foreign copper, or the goodwill of distant kings. When the Bronze Age networks collapsed, Egypt could fall back on its geographic advantages, its sustainable agricultural base, its long tradition of centralized administration. The price was isolation, stagnation, a long slow decline from the heights of the New Kingdom to the later periods when Egypt would become a prize fought over by foreign conquerors. But Egypt persisted. The temples kept their records. The pharaohs maintained their rituals. The Nile kept flowing. For the people who lived through the Dark Age in Greece and Syria and Anatolia and Cyprus, the experience must have been one of gradually accepting that the old world was not coming back. The grandfathers' stories of great palaces and distant voyages and cities filled with wonders must have seemed increasingly fantastical. Tales from a time beyond memory, legends that had less and less connection to the impoverished present, the skills that had sustained the Bronze Age world, the metalworking techniques that required tin from thousands of miles away, the scribal traditions that preserved knowledge across generations, the shipbuilding expertise that had allowed vessels to cross open water. These skills atrophied and were forgotten when the systems that had made them valuable no longer existed. A scribe with no palace to record, a bronze smith with no tin to alloy, a navigator with no ports to sail between. These specialists had no place in the Dark Age world, and their knowledge died with them. What emerged from the darkness was simpler, harder, more local. The Iron Age that followed the Bronze Age collapse was not initially an improvement. Iron was more common than bronze, but also more difficult to work, and early iron tools were often inferior to the bronze implements they replaced. But iron had one advantage that proved decisive. It did not require tin. A village could smelt iron from local ores, forge it into tools and weapons without access to trade routes that stretched to the mountains of Central Asia. The self-sufficiency that iron made possible was well suited to a world where the long-distance trade networks had collapsed, where communities had to rely on their own resources, where the interdependence of the Bronze Age had given way to the isolation of the Dark Age. The world that would eventually emerge from this darkness, the world of classical Greece and Phoenician trade and the Assyrian resurgence, would be built on different foundations. It would be more distributed, less dependent on palace centres, more resilient to local shocks because it was less interconnected in the first place. The lessons of the Bronze Age collapse would be written into the structure of the civilizations that followed, even if no one remembered what those lessons were or how they had been learned. The Dark Age was an interregnum, a period of forgetting, a time when the slate was wiped clean and new patterns could emerge. But for those who lived through it, the collapse was not a historical transition to be analysed. It was the end of the world, and yet the world did not end. It transformed. For even as the palace complexes smouldered and the trade routes fell silent, even as the scribes put down their styluses for the last time and the great ships rotted at their moorings, something was surviving. Not the empires themselves, not the kings or their dynasties, not the elaborate bureaucracies that had counted every jar of oil and every ingot of copper, but something more fundamental, more portable, more resilient than any palace archive. The human beings who stumbled out of the wreckage carried with them memories, skills, traditions, and stories. And from these fragments, a new world would slowly, painfully emerge. Along the Levantine coast, in the shadow of what had been Ugarit's gleaming harbour, the Phoenician city-states of Tyre and Sidon and Byblos endured. These were not newcomers to the region. By the time the Great Collapse swept through the eastern Mediterranean, cities like Byblos had already maintained their political independence for generations. As early as 1230 BCE, decades before the final cataclysm, these coastal settlements had asserted their maritime interests through overseas colonization and enjoyed the economic prosperity that came from controlling key stretches of coastline. Byblos in particular had long served as a centre for bronze making, and as the primary terminus of trade routes that stretched impossibly far eastward, bringing precious goods like tin and lapis lazuli from as far away as Afghanistan. What made the Phoenician cities different? Why did they survive when Ugarit, their neighbour and rival, was reduced to ashes? Part of the answer lies in geography and timing. The Phoenician coast was somewhat shielded, and the settlements there were smaller, less visible targets than the wealthy emporium at Ugarit. But the deeper answer may be structural. Phoenicia represents a zone where the Bronze Age Canaanite city-state culture survived the onslaught of the Sea Peoples. These were communities built on maritime trade, yes, but they were not palace economies in the same sense as Mycenaean or Pylos. They were more flexible, more adaptable. less dependent on the elaborate redistribution systems that collapsed so spectacularly elsewhere. When the trade networks fractured, the Phoenician cities contracted and adapted rather than disintegrating entirely. They waited out the worst of the storm, maintained their shipbuilding traditions, preserved their knowledge of distant ports and favourable winds, and when stability finally returned, they were positioned to rebuild the Mediterranean trading world on new foundations. The Phoenicians would eventually carry their alphabet, a writing system far simpler and more accessible than the cuneiform of Ugarit or the linear B of the Mycenaean scribes, across the entire Mediterranean basin. That alphabet would become the ancestor of Greek letters, of Latin, of the very script in which Western civilization would record its histories and its laws. The Dark Age did not preserve the complex scribal traditions of the Bronze Age, but it created conditions in which a simpler, more democratic form of writing could eventually flourish. This was not progress by design, it was adaptation through catastrophe. Further south along the coast, another group of survivors was establishing itself in the ruins of the old Canaanite order. The Peliset, those same warriors whom Ramses III had fought to a standstill in the Nile Delta, had not been destroyed by their defeat. They had been diverted. When the Egyptian pharaoh broke their naval assault, when their confederation shattered against the stockade of lances and the hail of arrows, the surviving Peliset found themselves in a curious position. They could not return home. Home no longer existed. The Aegean world they had fled was itself in ruins. They could not conquer Egypt. Ramses had proven that, so they settled. During the reign of Ramses III, these former enemies were allowed to resettle the coastal strip from Gaza to Joppa, establishing themselves in the cities that would become known as the 5 cities of the Philistines: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Ashdod. The Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu depict these Peliset not merely as warriors but as migrants, families on the move, women and children loading household goods into ox carts while the men fought. This was not a raiding party, it was a people seeking a new home after their old world had collapsed around them. And in their new Levantine settlements, they created something remarkable, a culture that blended Aegean traditions with local Canaanite practices. The Philistine material culture that archaeologists have uncovered demonstrates this synthesis vividly. Pottery styles that echo Mycenaean forms but are made from local clay, architectural techniques that marry Aegean and Levantine traditions, religious practices that drew from both worlds. The Philistines became, in a sense, living repositories of Aegean memory on the Levantine shore. They carried with them the fragments of the Bronze Age world they had fled, and those fragments became woven into the fabric of the new civilization they built. The Bible would remember them as enemies, as the giants against whom David fought, as the uncircumcised barbarians who threatened the Israelite tribes. But this was the view from the highlands, where a different group of survivors was carving out its own existence in the aftermath of collapse. The Philistines themselves, in their coastal cities, were building something new from something very old, a synthesis that would shape the Levantine coast for centuries. And what of the stories themselves? What of the memories that the survivors carried in their minds rather than in their ox carts? Consider what must have happened in Greece during the centuries of darkness. The palaces fell, the scribes died or adapted to new occupations, the Linear B tablets were buried in the rubble and forgotten. But the stories survived. Around 10,000 campfires across 400 years, in a Greece that had forgotten it had ever been literate, the bards kept singing. They sang of great kings and mighty warriors, of cities with high walls and treasures beyond counting, of ships that sailed in their thousands to wage war across the sea. They sang of Troy. We cannot know precisely how the oral tradition that would eventually become Homer's Iliad and Odyssey was transmitted across the Dark Age centuries. We cannot trace the lineage of singers who preserved these tales, cannot identify the moments when stories were embellished or forgotten, or merged with other traditions. What we know is the end result, that when Greece emerged from its dark age in the 8th century BCE, when the Phoenician alphabet arrived and Greeks began writing again, one of the first things they wrote down was poetry about a world that had been dead for 400 years. The Iliad does not describe the Greece of Homer's own time. It describes a memory of a memory of a memory, a Bronze Age world filtered through generations of oral transmission, transformed by centuries of retelling, but still recognizable as an echo of the palace civilization that had collapsed around 1200 BCE. The boar's tusk helmet that Homer describes Odysseus wearing, a helmet made of hundreds of curved boar's tusks sewn onto a leather cap, was an anachronism by the 8th century BCE. No one in Homer's Greece wore such things, but archaeologists have found boar's tusk helmets in Mycenaean graves, tangible proof that the oral tradition preserved genuine Bronze Age details across 4 centuries of forgetting. The catalogue of ships in the Iliad, with its obsessive listing of every contingent that sailed for Troy, has long puzzled readers. Why include such a tedious inventory in an epic poem? But the geography of that catalogue corresponds not to the Greece of Homer's day, but to the settlement patterns of the Bronze Age, preserved in verse long after the places themselves had changed beyond recognition. The bards who kept these stories alive across the Dark Age were doing something that the palace scribes could not do. They were preserving cultural memory without infrastructure. They needed no palaces, no archives, no redistribution systems to sustain them. They needed only an audience and a willingness to listen. In the isolated villages of Dark Age Greece, where literacy had been forgotten and the great centres had crumbled to ruins, the singers kept alive a vision of a more connected, more glorious past. And when that past finally merged with writing again, when the oral tradition became the foundation of Greek literature, the Bronze Age lived on in transformed form. The world of Agamemnon and Achilles, of Priam and Hector, became the shared inheritance of classical civilization, a mythologized memory of the interconnected world that had collapsed so completely that its very existence became the stuff of legend. This, then, was what crossed the threshold. The Phoenician sailors with their alphabet and their knowledge of distant shores, the Philistine settlers with their ox carts full of household goods and their Aegean memories, the Greek bards with their songs of a vanished world. Not everything survived. The palace bureaucracies, the complex redistribution systems, the elaborate diplomatic networks linking king to king across thousands of miles, these were lost, and the loss was permanent. The Bronze Age way of organising civilization, with its great palaces and its interdependent trade networks, was not reconstructed in the Iron Age. What emerged instead was something different, built on different principles, suited to a world where the old certainties had proven catastrophically fragile. The collapse of 1177 BCE, to use that date as the symbolic shorthand that scholars have adopted, was not unique in human history. Civilizations have risen and fallen before and since. But the Bronze Age collapse holds a particular significance, both for its scale and for its legacy. Within a few decades of that symbolic date, rebellions raged across the eastern Mediterranean, wars erupted that no single power could control, cities fell to ruin and were never rebuilt, writing systems vanished from entire regions, and cultures that had flourished for centuries seemed erased from the historical record. The catastrophe affected 8 powerful civilizations: Egyptians, Hittites, Canaanites, Cypriots, Minoans, Mycenaeans, Assyrians, and Babylonians, states that had been interconnected through trade, commerce, diplomacy, and cultural exchange for generations. The Hittite Empire fell and was forgotten so completely that for most of recorded history, scholars knew of it only from scattered biblical references. Ugarit was destroyed so thoroughly that its very location was lost until archaeologists rediscovered it in the 20th century. Mycenaean civilization vanished so entirely that the classical Greeks who inherited its legends had no idea that their ancestors had been literate, had built great palaces, had participated in a sophisticated international order. The archaeologist Eric Klein, surveying this devastation, proposed what he called a perfect storm thesis to explain the collapse. His central argument was that no single cause could account for what happened. The Sea Peoples alone, though devastating, were insufficient to topple every palace civilization in the eastern Mediterranean. Drought alone, though severe, had been survived before. Earthquakes alone, though destructive, could be recovered from. Internal rebellions alone, though dangerous, could be suppressed. But all of these factors struck simultaneously, or nearly so, between roughly 1225 and 1175 BCE. Each amplified the effects of the others. Drought weakened the agricultural base. Weakened agriculture strained the palace redistribution systems. Strained systems bred discontent and rebellion. Rebellions diverted resources from defense. Weakened defences opened the door to raiders and invaders. Raiders disrupted the trade networks. Disrupted trade meant no tin for bronze, no copper from Cyprus, no grain from Egypt. No bronze meant no tools, no weapons. No weapons meant no defence against the next wave of raiders. The system was so interconnected that a shock to any part of it rippled through the whole, and when multiple shocks struck at once, the entire edifice came crashing down. This is what makes the Bronze Age collapse resonate so powerfully with modern readers. We live in a world far more interconnected than anything the Bronze Age could have imagined, a world where disruptions in one region can cascade across the globe in ways that no single actor can control. The fragility that brought down the palace civilizations, their dependence on long-distance trade, their vulnerability to climate disruption, their elaborate systems that functioned beautifully under normal conditions but proved catastrophically brittle under stress. These are not ancient problems. They are modern ones, writ in bronze and clay rather than silicon and fibre optics. Egypt's victory against the Sea Peoples, the triumph of Ramses III in the Nile Delta, was in many ways a Pyrrhic one. The pharaoh broke the naval assault and scattered the confederation, yes, but the very success of Egypt's defence could not restore the world that had been lost. There would be no more diplomatic letters from the Hittite court, because there was no more Hittite court. There would be no more trade missions to Ugarit, because Ugarit was a ruin. There would be no more Mycenaean merchants bringing goods from the Aegean, because the Mycenaean palaces had collapsed and their harbours lay empty. Egypt won the battle, but lost the world it had known. The victory that Ramses commemorated so elaborately on the walls of Medinet Habu was not the preservation of the Bronze Age order. It was the beginning of Egypt's long, slow decline into regional isolation, the twilight of the new kingdom, the prelude to centuries of foreign domination. And so we come at last to the meaning of the Dark Age and what rose from its ashes. The centuries that followed the Bronze Age collapse were not a complete void. Life continued. Children were born and grew to adulthood. Farmers planted crops and herded animals. Villages existed, communities endured. Human beings went about the business of survival. But the scale of organisation contracted dramatically. The great palaces were not replaced by smaller palaces. They were replaced by nothing, by chieftains and village headmen, by local strongmen and petty kings whose authority extended no further than they could personally enforce it. The elaborate bureaucracies that had managed the palace economies simply ceased to exist. The trade networks that had knit the Eastern Mediterranean into a single economic system withered away. The technologies that had depended on those networks, bronzeworking, fine pottery, architectural engineering on a monumental scale, degraded or were lost entirely. In Greece, the population fell catastrophically. Some estimates suggest a decline of 90% from Bronze Age levels, though such numbers are necessarily speculative given the paucity of Dark Age evidence. What is clear is that the settlement patterns changed utterly. The great palace sites were abandoned or reduced to impoverished villages. The population dispersed into smaller, more isolated communities. The specialisation that had characterised Bronze Age society, the scribes, the metalworkers, the shipwrights, the administrators, gave way to a more generalised subsistence existence where everyone did a little of everything and no one could afford to specialise. And yet, the Dark Age was not merely destruction. It was also preparation, the very disconnection that made life so difficult in the centuries after 1200 BCE also created conditions for innovation. When the palace redistribution systems collapsed, they took with them the centralised control that had directed Bronze Age economies. What emerged in their place was more distributed, more local, more resilient to the failure of any single node. A village that depended only on its own resources could not be brought down by the interruption of trade routes thousands of miles away. A chieftain whose authority rested on personal relationships rather than bureaucratic position could adapt to changing circumstances in ways that palace kings could not. The Dark Age selected for survival strategies that were the opposite of Bronze Age interconnection, and those strategies became the foundation of the Iron Age civilizations that followed. Iron itself was part of this transformation. Not because iron was better than bronze. In many ways, early iron was inferior, but because iron was independent. The bronze alloy that had given the Bronze Age its name required copper and tin in specific proportions, and while copper was relatively common, tin was rare. The tin that reached the eastern Mediterranean came from mines in Central Asia, from mountains in what is now Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, transported across thousands of miles through exactly the kind of long-distance trade networks that the collapse destroyed. When those networks failed, bronze became impossible to produce in quantity, but iron ore was common, available in deposits across Europe and the Near East. A village could smelt its own iron, forge its own tools, without depending on trade routes that stretched beyond the horizon. The technological regression from bronze to iron was also paradoxically a form of liberation. Liberation from the fragile dependencies that had brought the Bronze Age world crashing down. The world that eventually emerged from the Dark Age was built on different principles than the world that had preceded it. The classical civilizations of Greece and Phoenicia and the Levant were not palace economies. They were city-states and trading federations, more distributed in their political organization, less dependent on centralized redistribution, more resilient to local shocks because they were less interconnected in ways that could cascade into system-wide collapse. The democratic institutions that emerged in Athens, the alphabetic literacy that spread from Phoenicia across the Mediterranean, the philosophical traditions that questioned received authority, all of these arose in a world shaped by the memory of catastrophe, even if no one could remember precisely what that catastrophe had been. The lessons of the Bronze Age collapse were written into the structure of the civilizations that followed, even when those lessons had been forgotten. The classical Greeks had no idea that their ancestors had been literate, that great palaces had once dominated their land, that an interconnected world of diplomatic exchange and long-distance trade had flourished and fallen. But they lived in a world shaped by that collapse, inheriting institutions and technologies and social patterns that had evolved specifically because the older patterns had proven vulnerable. The distributed, resilient, adaptable civilizations of the Iron Age were the products of a brutal selection process that had eliminated their more centralized, more efficient, more interconnected predecessors. The date of 11 to 77 BCE, like the date of 476 CE that marks the fall of Rome, is a scholarly convention, a symbolic threshold rather than a precise moment. The collapse did not happen in a single year. It unfolded across decades, perhaps across generations, as different regions fell at different times and the aftershocks rippled across the Mediterranean world. But the date serves its purpose. It marks the end of an era, the close of a chapter, the moment when one way of organizing civilization gave way to another. The Bronze Age collapse was history's first great civilizational reset. Not the last, history would see others, but the first for which we have substantial evidence, the first that we can study and analyze and attempt to understand. It serves as a mirror for our own time, a reminder that complex interconnected systems can fail in ways that are difficult to predict and impossible to reverse, that efficiency and resilience are often in tension, that the very networks that create prosperity can also transmit disaster. The survivors who emerged from the Dark Age, the Phoenician sailors, the Philistine settlers, the Greek villagers with their songs of Troy, did not know they were building a new world. They were simply trying to survive, adapting to circumstances they had not chosen, making use of whatever resources they could find. The great palace civilizations that had preceded them were becoming legend, stories told around campfires, memories that would eventually transform into myth. The future that lay ahead of them, the classical world, the alphabets and democracies and philosophical traditions, was unimaginable from where they stood, and perhaps that is the final lesson of the Bronze Age collapse. The end of one world is also the beginning of another. The destruction that seems total is never quite complete. Something always survives. Fragments of memory, seeds of tradition, human beings with their stubborn persistence and their capacity for adaptation. The palace civilizations of the Bronze Age were swept away, and with them went a way of life that would never return. But from the wreckage came the foundations of something new, a world less centralized, less interconnected, less efficient perhaps, but also more distributed, more resilient, more capable of surviving the shocks that history would continue to deliver. The Uluburun ship lies still at the bottom of the Mediterranean, its cargo of copper and tin and amber and ivory scattered across the seafloor, a time capsule from a world that no longer exists. The walls of Hattusa stand empty under the Anatolian sky, the treasury chambers long since looted, the archives scattered, the gods who once received offerings there forgotten except by archaeologists. The palace at Pylos is a labyrinth of ruined walls, the linear B tablets that recorded its final desperate preparations preserved by the very fire that consumed them. These are the monuments of the Bronze Age, ruins and wrecks, fragments and echoes, the material traces of civilizations that rose to heights of sophistication and interconnection, and fell into a darkness so complete that even their existence was forgotten. But the darkness lifted. It always does. The campfires where bards sang of Troy gave way to torchlit symposia, where Homer's verses were recited. The isolated villages of Dark Age Greece gave way to the city-states of the classical period. The Phoenician traders who survived the collapse carried their alphabet across the Mediterranean, and that alphabet became the vehicle for literatures and philosophies and histories that would shape the next 3,000 years. The catastrophe was real, the suffering was real, the loss was incalculable, but so was the renewal that followed, the slow rebuilding, the new patterns that emerged from the ruins of the old. The Bronze Age collapse reminds us that civilizations are not permanent. The systems that seem most stable, most prosperous, most sophisticated can fail in ways that their inhabitants cannot imagine until the failure is upon them. But it also reminds us that failure is not final. The human capacity for survival, for adaptation, for carrying forward some fragment of what was lost, this capacity outlasts any particular civilization, any specific system of organization. The world that died in the fires of 11th BCE was gone forever. The world that rose from those ashes carried forward something of what had been lost, transformed it into something new, and in time built civilizations whose achievements would surpass even the glories of the Bronze Age. The ships that once crossed the wine-dark sea laden with copper and tin, and the treasures of distant kings would sail again, under different flags, in different eras. The stories that were sung around the campfires of Dark Age Greece would be written down, would survive, would become the shared inheritance of civilizations that could not imagine the world from which those stories came. The collapse was not the end. It was, as all collapses are, a beginning disguised as an ending, a transformation so violent that it seemed like annihilation, but left behind it the seeds of everything that would follow. And somewhere beneath the waters of the Mediterranean, the Aluberan ship keeps its silent watch, holding in its shattered hull the last cargo of a vanished world, bronze and amber and ivory and glass, the treasures of 8 civilizations, the tangible proof of a connected world that flourished and fell, whose fall made possible the world we inhabit today.